Some voices follow you home, even when they shouldn't exist anymore. My name is Marcus Chen, and I've been driving 18-wheelers across America's highways for 22 years. I've hauled everything from electronics to livestock, crossed every interstate from coast to coast, and logged over 2 million miles without a single major accident. In this business, experience keeps you alive. Experience teaches you to trust your instincts, follow protocol, and listen to dispatch. But experience never prepared me for what happened on Interstate 80 in the Nebraska Sandhills during the winter of 2024. I worked for Midwest Transport Solutions out of Omaha, a mid-sized outfit with about 40 drivers and a reputation for reliable service. Our dispatch office was small, just 3 people working, rotating shifts to keep us moving around the clock. During my years there, I'd worked with all of them, but Sarah Kellerman had been my primary dispatcher for nearly a decade. She knew my roots, my preferences, and my quirks better than my ex-wife ever did. Sarah had a distinct voice, slightly gravelly from years of chain smoking, with a Nebraska accent that made road sound like road and about like a boot. She always signed off her radio calls with, "Stay safe out there, driver," delivered in the same warm but professional tone every single time. Sarah died in a car accident on Highway 36 in February of 2021. Black ice sent her Honda Civic into a concrete barrier at 60 miles per hour. The whole company attended her funeral. I was one of the pallbearers. 3 years later, her desk sat empty in the dispatch office, turned into a memorial with flowers that were changed weekly, and a small plaque reading Sarah Kellerman, Voice of the Road. The company never replaced her position directly. Instead, they redistributed her duties among the remaining dispatchers. We all adjusted, moved on, kept driving. Until that night in December, when her voice crackled through my CB radio again. I was hauling a load of farm equipment from North Platte to Grand Island, running my usual overnight shift to avoid daytime traffic. The Nebraska Sandhills stretched endlessly in all directions, a desolate landscape of frozen grass and scattered ranch lights under a moonless sky. My rig hummed along Interstate 80 at a steady 65 miles per hour, the only vehicle visible in either direction for miles. I'd driven this route hundreds of times, knew every truck stop, every way station, every mile marker by heart. The call came through on Channel 7 at exactly 2:33 in the morning. Unit 47, this is dispatch, come back. I almost drove off the road. The voice was unmistakably Sarah's, that same gravelly tone, that same Nebraska inflection. But Sarah had been dead for 3 years. I'd seen her casket lowered into the ground at Westlawn Memorial Cemetery. I'd watched her mother cry at the graveside service. I'd eaten potato salad at her memorial lunch in the church basement. My hands trembled as I reached for the CB handset. This is Unit 47, go ahead, dispatch. Marcus, I need you to take exit 267 instead of continuing to Grand Island. There's been an accident ahead, and we're rerouting all traffic through the back highways. Take 267 south to Highway 92, then east to reconnect with 80. Acknowledge, please. The voice was perfect. Every inflection, every pause, every subtle speech pattern matched my memories of Sarah exactly. But exit 267 was in the middle of nowhere, leading to a network of county roads through ranching country. I'd never taken that route before, and in my 22 years of driving, I'd never heard of Midwest Transport using those back highways for rerouting. Dispatch, can you confirm that routing? I'm not showing any traffic alerts on my GPS, and 267 looks pretty isolated. Marcus, trust me on this one. There's a multi-vehicle pileup about 10 miles ahead of your current position. State Patrol has the highway shut down completely. Take exit 267 now, and I'll guide you through the detour. Stay safe out there, driver. There it was, her signature sign-off, delivered in exactly the same tone she'd used thousands of times before. My rational mind screamed that this was impossible, that dead people don't give routing instructions, that I should ignore the transmission and continue on Interstate 80. But 22 years of conditioning made me reach for my turn signal. As exit 267 approached, the off-ramp curved down into darkness, away from the highway's sodium lights and into ranch country, where civilization existed only as distant porch lights scattered across the frozen landscape. My headlights cut through the night, illuminating a narrow two-lane road that stretched toward black hills on the horizon. No other traffic, no signs of the accident that supposedly blocked Interstate 80. No indication that anyone had used this route recently. Unit 47. This is dispatch. Continue south on County Road, 15 for approximately 12 miles, then turn east on Highway 92. Sarah's voice continued providing turn-by-turn directions, her tone as calm and professional as ever. But something felt wrong, beyond the obvious impossibility of her existence. The intervals between her transmissions were too precise, like clockwork rather than natural conversation. And she wasn't responding to any of my questions about the accident, the weather, or the unusual routing. I followed her instructions because I didn't know what else to do. Each turn took me deeper into the sandhills, further from major highways and civilization. The landscape grew more desolate with every mile, endless expanses of frozen grassland, broken only by the occasional ranch gate or cattle guard. My CB radio crackled with static between Sarah's transmissions, but no other voices came through. In this remote area, I should have been picking up chatter from other truckers, farmers, or emergency services. Instead, there was only Sarah's voice and miles of empty silence. Unit 47. Turn right on the upcoming gravel road. This will reconnect you with Interstate 80 in about 15 miles. The gravel road appeared in my headlights like a scar across the prairie, barely wide enough for my rig. No signs, no markers, just a rutted track disappearing into darkness between low hills. Every instinct I'd developed over 2 decades of driving told me not to take that turn. Gravel roads and fully loaded 18-wheelers don't mix, especially in winter conditions. If I got stuck out here, it could be hours before anyone found me. Dispatch, are you certain about this routing? This looks like a ranch access road, not a highway connection. Marcus, trust me. I've guided dozens of drivers through this detour tonight. Just follow the road for 15 miles, and you'll reconnect with the interstate. Keep your speed down on the gravel, and you'll be fine. Dozens of drivers. That phrase stuck with me as I reluctantly turned onto the gravel road. If dozens of drivers had used this route, where were they now? I hadn't seen a single truck since leaving Interstate 80 over an hour ago. The road ahead showed no tire tracks in the thin layer of snow, no signs that anyone had passed this way recently. The gravel crunched under my tires as I crept forward at 20 miles per hour, my headlights revealing an increasingly primitive track winding between hills and frozen ponds. After 5 miles, the road narrowed further, forcing overhanging tree branches to scrape against my trailer. After 10 miles, I realized I was completely lost in the Nebraska wilderness, with no cell phone signal and only Sarah's impossible voice for guidance. Unit 47, you're doing great. Just a few more miles to the interstate connection. But her voice had changed subtly. The warmth was gone, replaced by something hollow and mechanical. The Nebraska accent remained, but the natural speech rhythms had flattened into something that sounded rehearsed. And for the first time, I noticed something that made my blood freeze. She was using my name in every transmission, something the real Sarah had rarely done during routine routing instructions. I stopped the truck and grabbed my CB handset. Dispatch, I need to speak with a supervisor. This routing doesn't make sense, and I want confirmation before proceeding. Marcus, there's no time for delays. You need to continue following the road. Other drivers are counting on this route staying open. What other drivers? I haven't seen anyone else out here. Silence. For nearly a minute, only static came through the radio. When Sarah's voice returned, it sounded different again, more distant, as if she were speaking through water. Marcus, You know me. You've always trusted my routing. Just follow the road to the end, and everything will be clear. The end. Not the interstate connection or the highway, but the end. The phrase hung in the cold air of my cab like a physical presence. I realized then that I'd been hearing not Sarah's voice, but something wearing Sarah's voice like an ill-fitting mask. Whatever was speaking through my radio wanted me to reach the end of this isolated road, for reasons that had nothing to do with traffic, routing, or company dispatch. I put the truck in reverse and began backing up the narrow gravel road, using my mirrors and backup camera to navigate in the darkness. The voice on the radio began calling my name repeatedly, the transmissions coming faster and more urgent as I retreated toward the county highway. Marcus, stop. Marcus, you need to continue forward. Marcus, turn around. Marcus, don't leave the route. The voice multiplied, layering over itself until a dozen versions of Sarah seemed to be speaking simultaneously, all saying my name with increasing desperation. The sound filled my cab, impossibly loud for a CB radio transmission. I fumbled for the radio's power switch, but turning it off didn't stop the voices. They continued calling my name even with the radio silent, seeming to come from the very air around me. I drove through that chorus of impossible voices for 3 miles before reaching the county highway. As soon as my tires hit pavement, the voices stopped instantly, leaving only normal highway noise and the sound of my own terrified breathing. I didn't stop driving until I reached the first truck stop with other vehicles and people and the comfortable noise of normal life. The next morning, I called Midwest Transport's main office and spoke with our fleet manager about the previous night's routing instructions. He checked the dispatch logs for December 15th and found no record of any transmissions to Unit 47 after 6 p.m. the previous day. No accidents had been reported on Interstate 80. No detour routing had been authorized. Sarah Kellerman's radio call sign had been retired after her death and was not in use by any current dispatcher. When I described the gravel road I'd followed, the fleet manager went quiet for a long moment. Finally, he told me that 3 other drivers had reported similar routing instructions over the past 6 months. All 3 had described hearing Sarah's voice, directing them to remote locations. 2 had turned around, like I did. The third, a driver named Tommy Vasquez, had continued following the instructions to the end of the road. Tommy Vasquez never reached his destination. Search teams found his truck 3 days later, parked at the end of a gravel road 15 miles south of Interstate 80. The cab was empty, his personal belongings undisturbed, the engine still running. Tommy's body was never found. The official report classified his disappearance as unknown circumstances, but the local sheriff mentioned something that stayed with me. Tommy's CB radio was tuned to Channel 7, and according to the electronic logs, it had been transmitting continuously for the entire 3 days, sending only static into the empty Nebraska night. I still drive for Midwest Transport, but I avoid overnight runs through the sandhills now. Sometimes, when I'm running late-night routes on other highways, I hear voices on the CB that sound almost familiar. Dispatchers who retired years ago, drivers who died in accidents, voices from the past offering routing instructions to nowhere. I've learned to trust my own navigation over any voice that calls through the darkness, no matter how familiar it might sound, because some voices follow you home, and some roads lead places you're not meant to go. The memorial plaque still sits on Sarah's old desk in the dispatch office, surrounded by flowers that someone changes every week. But sometimes, when I'm picking up my load assignments in the early morning hours, I swear I can hear her voice echoing faintly through the empty hallways, still trying to guide drivers home. Some conversations leave marks on you, even when nobody else was listening. My name is Detective Rita Lawson, and I've worked highway patrol for the Nevada State Police for 16 years. I've investigated everything from routine traffic stops to multi-vehicle fatalities across the loneliest stretches of desert highway in America. Highway 50, between Ely and Carson City, is my regular beat 330 miles of mostly empty road that truckers call the loneliest road in America. In 16 years, I thought I'd seen every kind of strange behavior the desert could produce in people. Sleep deprivation, heat exhaustion, isolation, psychosis, all occupational hazards for anyone who spends too much time driving through Nevada's endless expanse of sagebrush and alkali flats. But I'd never encountered anything like the reports that started coming in about mile marker 237 in the summer of 2023. Mile marker 237 sits at a small rest area about 40 miles east of Austin, in the middle of absolutely nowhere. It's just a concrete picnic table, a trash barrel, and a gravel parking area big enough for maybe 6 vehicles, surrounded by low hills covered in desert scrub. The nearest town is 30 miles in either direction. Cell phone coverage is non-existent. Most travelers pass it without stopping, but it's positioned at exactly the point where long-haul truckers start feeling the strain of the desert crossing and need to pull over for a break. The first report came from a driver named Billy Patterson in late June. He'd stopped at 237 around midnight with transmission problems, frustrated and stranded with a load of electronics heading to Reno. According to Patterson, a maintenance worker appeared out of nowhere, a friendly guy named Bill, who seemed to know exactly what was wrong with the truck. Bill had the right tools, the right knowledge, and the right parts in his work van. He fixed Patterson's transmission in under an hour and refused any payment, saying he was just glad to help a fellow driver. Patterson thought it was odd that a maintenance worker would be out there at midnight, but he was grateful enough not to ask too many questions. He got back on the road, made his delivery on time, and didn't think about it again until he tried to send a thank you note to the Nevada Department of Transportation. That's when he learned that the state doesn't employ any maintenance workers in that area, and certainly not anyone working midnight shifts at remote rest stops. The second report came 2 weeks later from a woman named Carol Henderson, driving a refrigerated truck carrying produce to California. Same story, midnight stop, truck problems, helpful maintenance worker named Bill who appeared with exactly the right tools and expertise. Carol's air conditioning compressor had failed in 105-degree heat, and Bill not only fixed it, but recharged the entire cooling system for her frozen cargo. When she tried to pay him, he just smiled and said helping people was what he lived for. By the time Tommy Vasquez filed his report in early August, I was starting to pay attention to the pattern. Tommy was a veteran driver with 23 years of experience and a spotless safety record. He hauled construction equipment across the western states and had driven Highway 50 hundreds of times. On the night of August 7th, he stopped at mile marker 237 with brake problems. His air brake system was losing pressure, making it dangerous to continue over the mountain passes ahead. Like the others, Tommy described meeting Bill, the maintenance worker who appeared around 1 in the morning and spent nearly 3 hours helping repair the brake system. According to Tommy, Bill was a stocky man in his 50s, with graying hair, wearing a faded Nevada DOT work shirt, and carrying a professional toolkit. He was knowledgeable, friendly, and seemed genuinely invested in getting Tommy safely back on the road. What made Tommy's report different was that he'd recently installed a new dash cam system that recorded both the road ahead and the interior of his cab. The camera ran continuously while the truck was parked, capturing everything that happened during those 3 hours at mile marker 237. When I reviewed that footage, I felt something shift in my understanding of what was possible in this world. The video showed Tommy's truck pulling into the rest area at 12:58 a.m. Tommy climbed out, walked around the truck checking his brakes, and spent about 10 minutes under the hood examining the air brake compressor. Then he straightened up and began talking to someone off camera, gesturing and nodding as if engaged in conversation. For the next 3 hours, the footage showed Tommy working on his truck, but he was completely alone. The external camera angle showed the entire rest area, illuminated by Tommy's headlights and work lights. No other vehicles were present. No maintenance van, no tools except the basic kit from Tommy's truck. No second person anywhere in frame. But Tommy was clearly interacting with someone throughout the repair process. He would pause his work, nod, laugh at something apparently funny, and respond to questions that only he could hear. The most unsettling part was watching Tommy accept tools that weren't there. On camera, he would extend his hand, grasp empty air, and then use the motion of turning an invisible wrench or tightening a non-existent bolt. His hands moved with the precision of someone using actual tools, his facial expressions showing the concentration and satisfaction of making progress on a complex repair. At several points, Tommy stepped back and gestured for his invisible companion to take over parts of the repair. The camera showed him pointing to specific components, explaining procedures to empty air, and then standing aside as if someone else was working on the truck. During these intervals, Tommy's lips moved in what appeared to be casual conversation, the kind of shop talk that mechanics share while working together on a difficult problem. The brake system was genuinely repaired. When Tommy finished at 4:30 a.m., his truck's air pressure held steady, the warning lights had cleared, and he was able to continue his journey safely to Los Angeles. Whatever had been wrong with the brakes was fixed correctly, using professional techniques that Tommy, with his basic maintenance knowledge, shouldn't have known. I drove out to mile marker 237 the next afternoon to examine the site myself. The rest area looked exactly as it appeared in Tommy's dashcam footage. A simple roadside stop, with nothing unusual about its layout or condition. But when I walked around the area where Tommy had described meeting Bill, I noticed something that made me request a forensics team. There were 2 sets of footprints in the fine desert sand beside the parking area. One set matched Tommy's work boots perfectly. The other set belonged to someone wearing different boots, size 10 or 11, with a distinctive tread pattern that suggested work boots or hiking boots. The second set of prints followed the same path that Tommy had described Bill taking from the supposed location of the maintenance van, around the truck during the repair process, and back to where the van had allegedly been parked. But Tommy's dashcam footage clearly showed that no one else had been present during those 3 hours. The prints should not have existed. I spent the rest of that week interviewing other truckers who regularly used Highway 50, asking specifically about mile marker 237. 7 additional drivers came forward with similar stories, all describing encounters with Bill, the maintenance worker. The details were remarkably consistent: middle-aged man, graying hair, Nevada DOT shirt, professional tools, refusal to accept payment, and an unusual interest in helping stranded drivers. None of these encounters appeared in any official records. The Nevada Department of Transportation confirmed that they employed no one matching Bill's description and had no maintenance contracts covering that remote stretch of highway. The nearest official maintenance facility was over 100 miles away. On August 15th, I decided to spend a night at mile marker 237 myself, hoping to observe whatever was happening there. I parked my patrol car in a concealed position about a quarter mile away and used binoculars to watch the rest area throughout the night. Around 2 a.m., a semi-truck with trailer pulled into the rest stop. The driver got out, walked around his vehicle, and then began what appeared to be an animated conversation with someone I couldn't see. Through my binoculars, I watched the driver's behavior mirror exactly what I'd observed in Tommy's dashcam footage. The trucker gestured, nodded, laughed, and worked on his vehicle while clearly interacting with an invisible companion. At one point, he stepped back and pointed to his engine, as if explaining something to someone standing right beside him. The conversation appeared to continue for nearly 2 hours. When the trucker finished his repairs and drove away, I immediately drove to the rest area and examined the ground where he'd been working. Once again, I found 2 sets of footprints, the driver's boots and a second set, matching the same distinctive tread pattern I'd found after Tommy's encounter. I requested psychological evaluations for all the drivers who'd reported meeting Bill, thinking perhaps the isolation and stress of desert driving was causing shared hallucinations. But every evaluation came back normal. These were experienced, mentally stable professionals who had no history of psychological problems or substance abuse. Whatever they were experiencing at mile marker 237 was affecting people who had no reason to fabricate elaborate stories about helpful maintenance workers. The reports continued throughout the fall and winter. Always the same pattern: truckers with mechanical problems, nighttime encounters with Bill, successful repairs, and dashcam footage showing solitary drivers working alone while clearly believing they had help. The forensic evidence consistently showed 2 sets of footprints, where only one person should have been present. I've stopped investigating new reports about mile marker 237. The case files fill an entire drawer in my office, documenting dozens of encounters with someone who apparently doesn't exist in any conventional sense. The Nevada State Police officially classifies these incidents as unexplained phenomena, which is bureaucratic language for admitting we don't understand what's happening. But I drive past mile marker 237 regularly during my patrol shifts, and I've started noticing something that keeps me awake some nights. In the fine desert sand around the rest area, there are dozens of overlapping footprints from the second set of boots, the ones that belong to Bill. They crisscross the area in patterns that suggest someone has been walking there regularly for months, maybe years, always following the same paths around broken-down vehicles, always ending at the spot where the maintenance van should be parked. The prints never fade, despite wind and weather that should have erased them long ago. They're always fresh, always sharp, as if someone just walked through the sand moments before I arrive. Sometimes, when I'm examining the tracks in the late afternoon light, I catch myself looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see a stocky man in a faded work shirt walking toward me with a toolkit in his hand, ready to help with whatever might be wrong. I haven't stopped at mile marker 237 after dark since that night in August. Some conversations are better left unheard, and some help comes with questions that don't have comfortable answers. Sometimes, the loneliest conversations are the ones you think you're having with friends. My name is Rebecca Martinez, and I've been an owner-operator for 14 years, hauling freight across the Southwest in my 2019 Peterbilt. I know every truck stop, every way station, and every mile of Interstate 40 between Los Angeles and Albuquerque. I've driven through sandstorms, flash floods, and 120-degree heat. I've handled blowouts at 70 miles per hour and kept my rig moving through ice storms that shut down half the interstate. In 14 years, I thought I understood everything about life on the road, the rhythms of highway travel, the comfort of CB chatter, the unspoken bond between drivers who share America's loneliest highways. But I'd never experienced anything like what happened on the night of September 23, 2024. During what should have been a routine eastbound run from Barstow to Tucumcari, I picked up my load, 40,000 pounds of manufactured goods, at a warehouse in Barstow around 4 p.m., planning to drive through the night and deliver in New Mexico by noon the next day. The route was familiar: Interstate 40 east through the Mojave Desert, across Arizona, and into the high plains of New Mexico. I'd driven it hundreds of times, usually making the trip in about 12 hours with stops for fuel and mandatory rest breaks. The CB radio chatter started just after I crossed into Arizona, somewhere around Kingman. Channel 19 crackled to life, with the voice of a convoy leader calling himself Diesel Crawford, organizing eastbound trucks for a group run across the desert. His voice had that distinctive authority of an experienced driver, calm, professional, with the kind of natural leadership that made other truckers want to follow his guidance. "This is Diesel Crawford looking for eastbound company on 40. We got a nice group forming up here, planning to run together through the desert tonight. Weather's clear, traffic's light, and we can watch each other's backs across the long stretch. Any drivers interested in joining up, come back on 19. I'd participated in informal convoys before groups of trucks that traveled together for safety, fuel efficiency, and companionship during long stretches of empty highway. There's something reassuring about seeing other headlights in your mirrors and knowing that fellow drivers are nearby if problems arise. The desert crossing between Flagstaff and Albuquerque can feel endless during overnight runs, and convoy chatter helps pass the miles. Diesel Crawford, this is westbound Rebecca in the Red Pete. I'm running solo to Tucumcari. Interested in joining your group if there's room. Welcome aboard, Rebecca. You're running good equipment there. We got about 6 trucks in the group right now, planning to maintain 72 miles per hour through the desert and stop for fuel together in Gallup around 3 a.m. Sound good to you? His voice was warm and professional, exactly what you'd expect from an experienced convoy leader. I could see headlights ahead of me and behind me on the interstate, spaced at regular intervals that suggested an organized group. Everything felt normal, familiar, and safe. For the next 4 hours, Diesel Crawford maintained steady communication with the convoy. He called out road conditions, warned about construction zones, and coordinated lane changes through the sparse traffic. His voice became a constant presence in my cab, providing the kind of professional guidance and friendly conversation that makes long desert runs bearable. Rebecca, you got a Smoky at mile marker 193, eastbound side. Looks like he's running radar, so keep it at legal limits through there. Roger that, Diesel. Thanks for the heads up. No problem. How's that Pete running tonight? Sounds like you got some good power under the hood there. She's running sweet. Fresh rebuild on the engine last spring, and she's been solid ever since. What you running tonight? Classic 900 Kenworth. Been my road partner for 8 years now. She's got her quirks, but we understand each other. Hauling machinery parts to a construction site outside Santa Fe. What you got back there? The conversation continued naturally, the kind of road talk that passes time and builds camaraderie between drivers. Diesel asked about my route, my experience with different truck stops, my opinions on new emission regulations. I found myself looking forward to his transmissions, enjoying the company during what would otherwise have been a solitary night crossing. But around midnight, somewhere east of Flagstaff, I started noticing inconsistencies in our convoy's behavior. When Diesel called out road hazards or traffic conditions, I couldn't always verify what he was describing. He mentioned construction zones that I didn't encounter, warned about weather conditions that didn't match what I was seeing, and referenced landmarks that seemed to be in the wrong locations. Convoy. We got some rough road coming up through the construction zone. At mile marker 210, drop it down to 60 and watch for loose gravel on the right shoulder. I approached mile marker 210 expecting construction, but the highway was smooth and clear. No construction signs, no rough pavement, no gravel on the shoulder, just normal interstate with fresh asphalt and good visibility. Diesel. I'm not seeing any construction through here. Road looks clear to me. Copy that, Rebecca. Must be further ahead than I thought. Sometimes these mile markers get confusing in the dark. His explanation seemed reasonable, but over the next hour, similar discrepancies accumulated. Diesel described truck stops that weren't where he said they'd be, warned about traffic that I never encountered, and referenced weather conditions that didn't match the clear, calm night I was experiencing. More unsettling was the behavior of the other trucks in our supposed convoy. I could see headlights ahead of and behind me, maintaining the spacing that Diesel coordinated, but they never responded to his radio calls. Throughout 4 hours of active CB chatter, only Diesel and I had spoken. None of the other drivers had acknowledged instructions, reported road conditions, or joined the conversation that should have been natural among convoy members. Diesel. How come the other drivers aren't talking much tonight? Usually convoys have more chatter than this. Oh, you know how it is, Rebecca. Some drivers prefer to stay quiet and just listen. They're following instructions fine, maintaining good formation. Don't worry about the quiet ones, they're professionals. But professional drivers in convoys typically communicate regularly, especially during nighttime desert crossings. The silence from the other trucks felt wrong, like watching a movie with the sound turned off. Around 2 a.m., approaching Gallup where we'd planned to stop for fuel, I realized something that made my hands tighten on the steering wheel. I'd been watching the headlights behind me in my mirrors for hours, assuming they belonged to convoy members. But as we approached the brighter lights of town, I could see that those headlights belonged to vehicles traveling in the opposite direction on the westbound side of the divided highway. The lights I'd been interpreting as convoy members behind me were actually oncoming traffic, visible across the median but not traveling in the same direction. I'd been unconsciously creating a convoy formation from random vehicles that had nothing to do with our group. Diesel, I think there might be some confusion about our convoy formation. The lights I've been seeing don't seem to be eastbound trucks. Silence on Channel 19. For the first time in 4 hours, Diesel Crawford didn't respond immediately to my transmission. Diesel Crawford, you copy? This is Rebecca. Come back. More silence. I tried several more times, but Channel 19 had gone dead. No static, no background chatter, no response from the convoy leader who'd been talking to me constantly since Kingman. I pulled into the truck stop in Gallup around 2:30 a.m., expecting to meet the other convoy members for our planned fuel stop. The parking lot had maybe a dozen trucks, but none of them showed any signs of being part of an organized convoy. No drivers gathered for the kind of informal meeting that usually happens when convoys stop together. I parked and walked into the truck stop restaurant, looking for Diesel Crawford or any of the other convoy members. The restaurant was nearly empty, just a few individual drivers having late-night meals, none of them showing any recognition when I asked about the eastbound convoy. Excuse me, did you guys see the convoy that just pulled in? About 6 trucks running together from Arizona? The driver I approached, a veteran with 30 years of experience, looked at me with mild confusion. Haven't seen any convoy tonight, miss. Been here about an hour, and trucks have been coming and going individually. You running with a group? I described the convoy, mentioned Diesel Crawford's distinctive voice and leadership, and asked if anyone had heard our CB chatter on Channel 19. 3 different drivers told me the same thing. Channel 19 had been quiet all night, except for occasional individual transmissions. No convoy chatter, no organized group communication, no convoy leader coordinating eastbound traffic. One driver, an older man named Pete, who'd been monitoring his CB throughout the night, offered to check his radio's memory function. Modern CB radios can store recent transmissions, and Pete's unit showed the channels and times of recent activity. According to his radio's log, Channel 19 had recorded only my voice for the past 4 hours, my side of conversations with someone who apparently wasn't transmitting anything. According to this, you were talking to yourself out there, miss. Radio shows your transmissions coming in clear, but no responses from anyone else. You feeling okay? Desert driving can play tricks on people sometimes. I spent another hour at the truck stop, asking every driver about the convoy and checking with the fuel desk staff. Nobody had seen 6 trucks traveling together. Nobody had heard Diesel Crawford's voice on the CB. According to everyone I talked to, I'd driven alone across the Arizona desert, broadcasting responses to conversations that only I could hear. The fuel desk manager, concerned about my apparent disorientation, suggested I get some rest before continuing to New Mexico. But I felt completely alert and rational, just confused about how I could have experienced 4 hours of detailed conversation with someone who apparently didn't exist. I checked my own CB radio, trying to find some technical explanation for what had happened. The radio was functioning normally, receiving transmissions from other trucks and broadcasting clearly when I tested it. Nothing wrong with the equipment, no signs of interference or malfunction. The drive from Gallup to Tucumcari passed in uncomfortable silence. I kept my CB tuned to Channel 19, hoping to hear Diesel Crawford's voice again or find some explanation for the night's events. But the channel remained quiet, except for normal trucker chatter brief exchanges about road conditions, weather reports, and casual conversation between drivers who could verify each other's existence. I delivered my load on schedule and spent the rest of the day trying to rationalize what had happened. Sleep deprivation seemed like the most logical explanation, except that I'd felt alert and focused throughout the night. Heat exhaustion didn't fit, temperatures had been comfortable, and I'd stayed hydrated. Equipment malfunction couldn't account for 4 hours of consistent, detailed conversation that seemed completely real at the time. 3 weeks later, I was deadheading back to California when I stopped at the same Gallup truck stop for fuel. While paying inside, I struck up a conversation with an older driver who looked familiar from my previous visit. "You're the lady who was asking about a convoy a few weeks back, aren't you? Been thinking about that since you mentioned it." I confirmed that I was, and he continued with something that made my coffee cup shake in my hands. "Had a driver come through here about 6 months ago with the same story. Lady named Jennifer something, talking about following a convoy leader called Diesel across the desert. Same deal, nobody else heard the CB chatter. No convoy visible to other drivers. She seemed pretty shook up about it." He paused, studying my face. "Then about 2 months after that, another driver, young guy, can't remember his name, but same exact story. Convoy leader called Diesel Crawford. Hours of CB conversation, but he was driving alone the whole time. I asked if he knew anything about this Diesel Crawford, but he just shook his head. Never heard the name before these incidents. Been driving this route for 25 years. Know most of the regular drivers out here. No convoy leaders named Diesel that I know of. I still drive Interstate 40 regularly. Still cross the Arizona desert on overnight runs. But I keep my CB radio turned to different channels now, avoiding 19 during those long stretches between Kingman and Gallup. Sometimes, when the highway is empty and the desert feels infinite around me, I hear fragments of conversation on distant channels, a voice that might be Diesel Crawford, still organizing convoys, still offering guidance and companionship to drivers who don't realize they're traveling alone. The loneliest road in America got a little lonelier after that night, because now I know that even the voices keeping you company might be nothing more than echoes in the dark. Some places remember what they used to be, even when buried beneath 40 feet of water and ice. My name is Daniel Kowalski, and I've been driving refrigerated transport trucks across the northern tier states for 18 years. I specialize in cold weather hauling frozen foods, pharmaceuticals, anything that needs to stay at precise temperatures during long-distance transport. Montana in January is brutal territory, with temperatures that can drop to 30 below zero and winds that turn highway driving into a battle for survival. But the pay is good, the roads are usually clear, and most drivers avoid the northern routes in winter, which means less competition for the premium loads. I've driven Route 93 between Kalispell and the Canadian border hundreds of times, hauling everything from frozen fish to medical supplies for remote communities. It's a lonely stretch of highway that cuts through some of the most isolated country in the continental United States. Endless forests of pine and aspen, frozen rivers, and small towns separated by 50-mile gaps of wilderness. During winter months, you might drive for hours without seeing another vehicle, especially on the overnight runs that I prefer for avoiding daytime traffic delays. The stretch of highway that passes Deadwater Lake is particularly desolate. The lake itself is an artificial reservoir created in the late 1980s for a hydroelectric project covering about 3 square miles of what used to be forest and ranch land. During summer months, it's a popular fishing spot, but in winter, it becomes a sheet of black ice surrounded by snow-covered hills. The highway runs along the eastern shore for about 5 miles, with guardrails separating the road from a steep drop down to the lake's edge. I'd driven past Deadwater Lake countless times without giving it much thought. It was just another landmark on a familiar route, a place to check my mileage and calculate arrival times. But on the night of January 15th, 2024, something about the lake made me slow down and look more carefully at the ice below. I was hauling a load of frozen pharmaceuticals from a distribution center in Kalispell to a medical facility in Lethbridge, running about 3 hours behind schedule due to a delayed pickup. The temperature outside was 22 below zero, and the lake's surface was frozen solid, a smooth sheet of black ice that reflected my headlights like a dark mirror. Snow had been falling lightly for the past hour, and my wipers swept rhythmically across the windshield as I maintained a steady 50 miles per hour along the curving highway. Around midnight, as I rounded a bend that offered a clear view across the entire lake, I noticed something that made me ease off the accelerator. There were lights beneath the ice, dozens of them, arranged in patterns that looked almost like vehicle headlights. The lights were dim and yellowish, clearly visible through the frozen surface, but too regular and organized to be natural phenomena. At first, I thought they might be some kind of underwater research equipment or fish attractors used by ice fishermen. But the arrangement was wrong for scientific instruments, and the lights were too bright and too numerous to be fishing equipment. They appeared to be moving in slow, deliberate patterns beneath the ice, following what looked like established routes across the lake bottom. I pulled over at a scenic overlook about a mile past the lake, parked my rig, and walked back along the shoulder to get a better view. The overlook was just a small gravel area with a historical marker and a wooden bench, positioned to give travelers a panoramic view of the reservoir. From this elevated position, I could see the entire lake spread out below, and the underwater lights were clearly visible from shore to shore. There had to be at least 30 separate light sources moving beneath the ice. Each light appeared to be a pair of beams, like vehicle headlights, maintaining consistent spacing and following what seemed to be predetermined paths. Some lights moved from the northern shore toward the southern end of the lake. Others traveled east to west or followed curved routes that suggested they were navigating around obstacles on the lake bottom. The movement was too slow and steady to be vehicles, but too purposeful and organized to be natural phenomena. Each set of lights maintained the same distance from its neighbors, like traffic following established lanes. When lights going in opposite directions passed each other, they maintained proper spacing as if following traffic rules that applied even underwater. I stood at that overlook for nearly an hour, watching the lights traverse the lake bottom in their mysterious patterns. The temperature was dropping, and my breath formed thick clouds in the frigid air, but I couldn't bring myself to leave. There was something hypnotic about the underwater procession, something that demanded attention despite the rational impossibility of what I was observing. Around 1:30 in the morning, I noticed that some of the lights were approaching the eastern shore directly below where I stood. As they drew closer to the shallower water near the shoreline, I could make out more details that made my hands shake despite the thick gloves I wore. The lights weren't just random beams, they were clearly vehicle headlights, complete with the distinctive spacing and intensity patterns of truck lighting systems. I could even distinguish between different types of headlights: the round sealed beam units common on older trucks, the rectangular headlights popular in the 80s, and the distinctive arrangements used on various truck models. But these headlights were 30 feet underwater, moving along the bottom of a lake that had been created decades ago. There was no logical explanation for their presence, their movement, or their continued operation in an environment where no vehicles could possibly function. As I watched, one set of lights approached the shore directly below my position and stopped, as if the invisible driver had decided to park. The headlights remained steady, pointing up toward the surface and casting wavering beams through the dark water and ice. For several minutes, nothing changed. The lights simply remained stationary, like a truck idling at a rest stop. Then the driver's side door light came on. The small interior light was clearly visible through the ice, illuminating what appeared to be the cab of a large truck. I could see the silhouette of someone moving inside the cab, the familiar shape of a driver adjusting mirrors or checking paperwork before resuming a journey. The dome light cast enough illumination to reveal details of the truck's interior dashboard instruments, hanging air fresheners, the distinctive high seating position of a commercial vehicle cab. After about 5 minutes, the interior light went out, and the headlights began moving again, following what seemed to be an established route toward the center of the lake. Other lights continued their own journeys across the lake bottom, maintaining their steady pace and mysterious purpose. I watched until nearly 3 in the morning, documenting patterns and trying to understand what I was seeing. The lights followed consistent routes, suggesting they were navigating familiar roads or pathways that existed before the lake was created. Some lights would stop for a few minutes, as if making deliveries or taking breaks, then resume their underwater journeys. The overall pattern suggested a transportation network that continued operating despite being submerged beneath 40 feet of water and ice. When I finally returned to my truck and continued toward Lethbridge, I spent the rest of the drive trying to rationalize what I'd observed. Bioluminescent fish, underwater construction equipment, reflected lights from aircraft, nothing adequately explained the organized movement and vehicle-like characteristics of the lights beneath Deadwater Lake. I delivered my load on schedule and spent my mandatory rest period researching the history of the area around Deadwater Lake. What I discovered in the local library's newspaper archives made me understand why I'd seen truck headlights beneath the ice, even though I wished I didn't know. Before the hydroelectric project created Deadwater Lake, the area had been home to a small community called Riverside Junction. The town's main feature was a truck stop and service center located at the intersection of 2 county roads, serving drivers who hauled logs, cattle, and supplies through the remote region. The truck stop included fuel pumps, a restaurant, a small motel, and a large parking area where drivers could rest during mandated break periods. In 1986, the federal government began construction of the Deadwater Dam as part of a regional power generation project. The rising reservoir would flood Riverside Junction and several surrounding ranches, requiring the relocation of residents and businesses. Most of the community had been evacuated by the spring of 1987, but the truck stop remained partially operational to serve the construction crews building the dam. According to newspaper reports from May of 1987, an unexpected spring thaw combined with heavy rainfall caused the partially completed dam to fail catastrophically. The floodwaters rose much faster than predicted, trapping several vehicles and structures before they could be evacuated. Among the casualties were 7 long-haul truckers who had been resting at the truck stop when the flooding began. The truckers' names were listed in the newspaper obituaries: Robert Chen, Patricia Williams, James Martinez, Carol Thompson, Michael Rodriguez, Lisa Park, and Frank Kowalski, my own uncle, whom I'd been named after. I'd grown up hearing family stories about Uncle Frank's disappearance during a hauling job in Montana, but no one had ever mentioned the specific circumstances or location. The newspaper described how the truckers had apparently tried to move their vehicles to higher ground, but were overwhelmed by the speed of the flooding. Their trucks were never recovered from the lake bottom, and their bodies were found weeks later when the water level stabilized. The truck stop's ruins, along with 7 loaded semi-trucks, remained submerged beneath Deadwater Lake. I've driven past Deadwater Lake many times since that January night, but I've never stopped to look at the underwater lights again. Sometimes, when the ice is particularly clear and the conditions are right, I can see the lights from my truck as I drive along the shoreline highway. They're still down there, still following their routes, still making their deliveries 30 feet beneath the surface. The local trucking community has its own stories about Deadwater Lake drivers who report seeing ghostly headlights in their mirrors when passing the reservoir, CB radio chatter that sounds like dispatchers calling drivers who died decades ago, and the persistent rumor that truckers who stop to help stranded motorists near the lake sometimes encounter drivers whose rigs are too old to be on the road anymore. I've never discussed what I saw that night with other drivers, partly because I don't expect to be believed, and partly because I understand now that some of those lights beneath the ice belong to family. Uncle Frank is still down there, still trying to complete his final delivery, still following roads that exist only in memory and water. Some nights, when I'm driving the lonely stretches of highway through northern Montana, I tune my CB radio to channel 19 and listen to the static. Sometimes, in the white noise between stations, I hear voices that sound familiar. Dispatchers coordinating loads, drivers checking in with their positions, the ordinary chatter of a trucking community that refuses to acknowledge that their roads have been underwater for over 30 years. Sometimes the people who help you most are the ones who should have stopped working years ago. My name is Angela Foster, and I've been driving long-haul routes for 12 years, mostly running the Interstate 75 corridor between Detroit and Miami. It's steady work with predictable schedules, and I've developed routines that keep me safe and efficient during the long hours on the road. I know which truck stops have the cleanest restrooms, which diners serve coffee strong enough to keep you alert through a night run, and which fuel islands process transactions fastest when you're racing against delivery deadlines. The TA Truck Plaza at exit 127 in Kentucky became my regular stop about 3 years ago. It's perfectly positioned for my typical routing, far enough south of Louisville to avoid urban traffic delays, but not so far that it throws off my schedule for deliveries in Atlanta or Jacksonville. The facility is modern and well-maintained, with adequate parking, good lighting, and the kind of professional service that makes overnight stops comfortable rather than stressful. But the main reason I started stopping there regularly was Carl Brennan, the night auditor who worked the midnight to 8 a.m. shift at the fuel desk. Carl was probably in his early 60s, with gray hair, wire-rimmed glasses, and the kind of genuine friendliness that's become rare in the service industry. He remembered regular customers, knew their usual purchases, and took personal interest in helping drivers solve problems or find what they needed. Carl knew I preferred Pump 12 because it was positioned for easy trailer clearance, that I always bought 2 large coffees and a protein bar for the next leg of my route, and that I needed receipts printed rather than emailed for my company's accounting system. More importantly, he understood the rhythm of long-haul driving and never rushed transactions or made small talk when it was obvious that a driver was fighting fatigue or dealing with tight deadlines. Over 3 years of regular stops, Carl and I developed the kind of comfortable professional relationship that makes life on the road more pleasant. He'd save the good coffee for drivers he knew would appreciate it, warn us about construction delays or weather problems ahead, and sometimes bend company policies to help drivers who were dealing with equipment problems or scheduling conflicts. Evening, Angela. How's that Detroit to Jacksonville run treating you tonight? Not too bad, Carl. Made good time through Ohio, but I'm running about an hour behind because of that backup at the Lexington way station. I heard about that on the CB chatter. They've got extra inspectors working tonight, checking logbooks pretty carefully. You should be clear sailing once you get south of here, though. Weather's been good all the way down to the Georgia line. These conversations became a comfortable part of my routine, a few minutes of human connection during otherwise solitary nights. Carl seemed genuinely invested in the success and safety of the drivers who stopped at his truck plaza, treating his job as more than just processing transactions and maintaining facility security. In early November of 2024, I noticed that Carl seemed more tired than usual during my regular stops. He moved more slowly, spent longer periods sitting at his desk between customers, and occasionally seemed to lose track of our conversations mid-sentence. When I asked if he was feeling well, he mentioned that he'd been working extra shifts to cover for staffing shortages and was looking forward to taking some vacation time around the holidays. Management finally approved that time off I've been requesting. Going to visit my sister in Florida, maybe do some fishing. Haven't had a proper vacation in years. I was genuinely happy for Carl, knowing how hard it could be for overnight workers to get time off during the busy holiday travel season. But I was also concerned about who would cover his shifts and whether the substitute auditor would maintain the same level of service that made this truck plaza my preferred stop. When are you planning to take that vacation, Carl? I'll miss having someone here who actually knows what they're doing. Should be sometime in December, once they get the temporary replacement trained. Don't worry though, this place pretty much runs itself these days. Most everything's computerized now. That comment struck me as odd, since Carl's personal attention and problem-solving abilities were exactly what made this truck plaza special. But I assumed he was being modest about his contributions to the facility's smooth operation. 3 weeks later, during a routine stop around 2 a.m. on November 28th, I walked into the truck plaza, expecting to see Carl at his usual position behind the fuel desk counter. Instead, I found the counter area empty, with only the automated payment kiosks operating and a sign directing customers to use the self-service systems for all transactions. I approached the counter, looking for a night manager or a security guard who could process my fuel receipt and answer questions about Carl's vacation schedule. The building seemed unusually quiet, with only the humming of refrigeration units and the distant sound of trucks idling in the parking lot. "Hello? Is there anyone working the desk tonight?" No response. I walked around the counter area, checking the back office and break room for staff members. The office was empty, with computer screens showing automated monitoring systems, but no signs of human occupancy. A time clock near the back door showed several day shift employees had clocked in and out normally, but no entries for night shift workers. Confused and slightly irritated, I approached the customer service kiosk to find contact information for the truck plaza's management. If Carl was on vacation and they hadn't arranged proper coverage for his shift, I wanted to file a complaint about the reduction in service quality. The kiosk's directory showed a management office phone number, and I used my cell phone to call during what should have been business hours. A recorded message provided general information about the facility, but included an option to speak with the overnight manager. When I selected that option, the system informed me that the night audit position had been eliminated, and all overnight operations were now fully automated. Eliminated, not temporarily covered or reassigned, eliminated entirely. According to the automated message, the TA Truck Plaza had converted to 24-hour self-service operations in 2014, using computerized systems to monitor fuel pumps, security cameras, and facility maintenance. No human staff worked overnight shifts anymore. But I'd been talking to Carl Brennan for 3 years. I'd watched him handle complex customer service issues, process special transactions, and coordinate with maintenance crews during overnight repairs. He wasn't an automated system, he was a real person who remembered my preferences, asked about my routes, and took personal pride in helping drivers. I called the main management office the next day, reaching a district supervisor who seemed confused by my questions about Carl Brennan and the night audit position. According to her records, the truck plaza had been fully automated for overnight operations since 2014. The last human night auditor had been eliminated during a company-wide restructuring program designed to reduce labor costs and improve efficiency. "Ma'am, I understand your confusion, but we definitely don't have anyone named Carl working at that location. Our system shows all your recent transactions were processed through the automated kiosks. Are you sure you haven't been mixing up different truck stops?" I wasn't mixing up anything. I had clear memories of hundreds of conversations with Carl, detailed recollections of his appearance and personality, and specific examples of problems he'd helped me solve over 3 years of regular stops. But according to official records, none of those interactions had ever happened. That evening, I made a special detour to stop at the truck plaza again, determined to find some evidence of Carl's existence or get a rational explanation for the discrepancy. I arrived around midnight, my usual time for stopping during southbound runs, and parked at my regular pump. The fuel island operated normally, accepting my credit card and processing the transaction through automated systems. But as I finished fueling and prepared to leave, I noticed someone moving inside the building behind the darkened counter area. Through the windows, I could see a figure in the night auditor's office, sitting at the desk where Carl usually worked. The person appeared to be an older man with gray hair, wearing what looked like a truck plaza uniform shirt. He seemed to be working at a computer, occasionally looking up toward the fuel islands as if monitoring customer activity. I walked to the building's main entrance, expecting to find it locked since the automated system supposedly handled all overnight operations. But the door opened normally, and I entered the brightly lit convenience store area. The figure I'd seen through the window was no longer visible behind the counter, and the night auditor's office appeared to be empty. "Carl, are you here? I wanted to ask about your vacation schedule." My voice echoed through the empty building, receiving no response except the electronic beeping of automated systems and the humming of refrigeration units. I walked to the counter area, looking for any signs of human occupancy in the night auditor's workspace. The office was set up exactly as I remembered it: desk, computer, telephone, and the personal touches that Carl had added over his years of employment. A coffee mug with "World's Best Grandpa" sat beside the keyboard. Family photos were arranged on a shelf behind the desk. A small radio was tuned to a country music station. Everything looked current and actively used, not like a workspace that had been abandoned for over a decade. But when I tried to interact with the computer or checked for current work schedules, I discovered that the equipment wasn't actually functional. The computer screen showed what appeared to be active monitoring systems, but the keyboard and mouse didn't respond to input. The telephone had no dial tone. The coffee in the mug was cold and appeared to have been sitting there for days. As I stood in that impossibly preserved office, trying to understand how I could have been interacting with someone who didn't exist, I heard footsteps approaching from the back of the building. Carl Brennan walked into the office area, wearing his usual uniform and carrying a clipboard, as if he'd just completed routine security rounds. "Evening, Angela. Sorry I wasn't at the desk when you came in. Had to check on a problem with the loading dock lights. Everything okay with your fuel tonight?" He looked exactly as I remembered him. Same gray hair, same wire-rimmed glasses, same friendly smile. But something felt different about his presence, as if he were slightly out of focus or viewed through imperfect glass. His voice had the same warm tone, but it seemed to come from slightly too far away, even though he was standing directly in front of me. "Carl, I was worried about you. Management told me the night audit position was eliminated years ago, and there's some confusion about whether you actually work here." His smile never wavered, but something shifted in his expression, a momentary confusion, as if he were trying to remember something important but couldn't quite grasp it. "Oh, that's just bureaucratic nonsense, Angela. You know how corporate offices are with their reorganizations and policy changes. I've been working here for years, and I'll keep working here as long as drivers need someone to help them. That's what this job is about, taking care of people." He processed my receipt with the same efficient movements I'd observed hundreds of times, printed the documentation I needed, and handed me my usual coffee and protein bar. Everything proceeded exactly as it always had, except that I now knew this interaction was impossible, according to every official record and automated system. "Carl, when did you start working here? I mean, what year did you begin this job?" Another moment of confusion flickered across his features, and his hand paused while reaching for the coffee pot. "I've been here a long time, Angela. Sometimes it feels like I've always been here, taking care of drivers, making sure everyone gets what they need. That's important work, you know. People depend on us." I left the truck plaza that night with my usual supplies and receipt, but also with the growing certainty that I'd been receiving help from someone who shouldn't exist. Over the following weeks, I researched the truck plaza's history and discovered that Carl Brennan had indeed worked there as a night auditor until he died of a heart attack at his desk in February of 2013. According to the obituary I found in local newspapers, Carl had worked overnight shifts at the truck plaza for over 15 years, developing a reputation among regular customers for exceptional service and genuine care for driver welfare. He'd been found at his desk during a routine morning shift change, apparently having died peacefully while working through a quiet night. The obituary mentioned that Carl had no immediate family, and that his funeral was attended primarily by truck drivers who'd known him through his work. Several drivers had told reporters that Carl treated his job as a calling rather than employment, believing that helping people was the most important thing anyone could do. I still stop at that truck plaza during my regular runs, but I use the automated systems now and avoid going inside the building during overnight hours. Sometimes, when I'm fueling my truck around 2 a.m., I can see lights in the Night Auditor's office and the silhouette of someone working at the desk. Other drivers have mentioned seeing the same thing, and a few have told me they've received help from a friendly night auditor who remembers their preferences and takes personal interest in their welfare. But I've learned not to walk into that building after midnight because some conversations are too comfortable to be real, and some help comes from people who finished their work years ago but never quite figured out how to stop. Some frequencies carry more than just voices. They carry the weight of every mile driven and every friend lost along the way. My name is Robert Sullivan, though everyone in the trucking community has called me Big Bob for the past 31 years. I've been hauling freight across the western states since 1993, back when CB radios were essential survival equipment and GPS systems were still science fiction. I know every grade, every truck stop, and every dangerous stretch of highway between the Pacific Coast and the Rocky Mountains. More importantly, I've known the voices, the community of professional drivers who share information, warnings, and companionship across the loneliest miles of America's transportation network. In 31 years of driving, you accumulate a lot of voices. Some belong to drivers you meet regularly at truck stops or shipping facilities. Others are just familiar call signs that you hear consistently on certain routes, voices that become as reliable as mile markers for marking your progress through familiar territory. And too many of those voices eventually go silent victims of jackknifed trailers, blown tires at highway speeds, heart attacks in sleeper cabs, or the 1,000 other ways that life on the road can end without warning. I specialize in hauling oversized loads through mountain passes, which means I spend a lot of time on Interstate 84 through Echo Canyon in northeastern Utah. It's a challenging stretch of highway that drops 3,000 feet in elevation over 15 miles, with grades steep enough to burn out brakes and curves sharp enough to roll a trailer if you take them too fast. The canyon walls create a natural amplifier for radio signals, which means CB chatter carries farther and clearer than it does on flat highway stretches. Echo Canyon has always been a communication hub for westbound truckers. Drivers share brake temperature readings, warn about crosswinds at the canyon mouth, and coordinate with each other to avoid putting too many heavy trucks on the grade at the same time. The CB chatter through that stretch tends to be professional and focused drivers who understand that careless mistakes can kill people. On the morning of October 12th, 2024, I was making my usual descent through Echo Canyon with a load of construction equipment bound for a job site in Nevada. Weather conditions were deteriorating rapidly, with fog rolling in from the west and early snow beginning to accumulate on the higher elevations. Visibility was dropping, and the combination of moisture and temperature changes was creating hazardous driving conditions. Around mile marker 15, my CB radio crackled with a familiar voice, providing detailed weather updates for westbound traffic. Eastbound and down. This is Smokey Joe with a weather report for you westbound drivers hitting the canyon. We got fog thickening up at mile marker 12. Visibility down to about a quarter mile. Road surface is getting slick with that snow mixing in, so watch your speed on the grade. Temperatures dropping fast should hit freezing in about an hour. I recognized the voice immediately. Joe Martinez had been hauling livestock through mountain passes for over 20 years, and his weather reports were legendary among drivers for their accuracy and detail. Joe understood mountain weather patterns better than most meteorologists, and his warnings had probably prevented hundreds of accidents over the years. The The problem was that Joe Martinez had died in a rollover accident on Interstate 70 in Colorado 3 years earlier. I'd attended his funeral, watched his wife cry at the graveside service, and heard the eulogies from dozens of drivers whose lives he'd saved with his careful attention to road conditions. But there was no mistaking his voice, the slight Spanish accent, the professional tone, the precise terminology he used for describing weather and road conditions. It was definitely Joe Martinez, providing those weather updates, even though Joe Martinez had been dead since 2021. Smokey Joe, this is Big Bob, westbound at mile 15. Appreciate the weather report. You running eastbound this morning? No response. The radio went quiet, except for normal static and the occasional transmission from other drivers discussing load schedules and fuel stops. But Joe's weather predictions proved accurate. Fog thickened exactly where he'd said it would. Visibility dropped to dangerous levels, and the temperature continued falling just as he'd predicted. About 10 miles further down the grade, another familiar voice came through the radio with a traffic advisory. Westbound traffic. This is Midnight Express, with a heads up on road conditions. We got a four-wheeler spun out at mile marker 7, blocking the right lane. Looks like they hit a patch of black ice and lost control. Emergency vehicles are responding, but expect delays and watch for ice patches through that section. Midnight Express was the call sign used by Patricia Wong, a driver who'd specialized in overnight runs between California and Colorado for 15 years. Patricia had been killed in a head-on collision with a drunk driver outside of Bakersfield in 2019. But her voice was unmistakable, the same calm professionalism, the same precise descriptions of road hazards that had made her transmissions valuable survival information for other drivers. Again, her report proved completely accurate. At mile marker 7, I found a sedan that had spun off the highway, emergency vehicles with flashing lights, and patches of black ice that were nearly invisible until your tires hit them. Without Patricia's warning, I might have encountered that hazard at full highway speed instead of being prepared for hazardous conditions. Over the next hour, as I completed my descent through Echo Canyon and continued west toward Nevada, my CB radio became a conduit for voices from the past. Driver after driver provided traffic updates, weather warnings, and road condition reports, all from truckers I'd known personally, all from truckers who had died in various accidents over the past decade. Big Bob, this is Desert Rose with a fuel advisory. That truck stop at exit 47 is out of diesel, but the Sinclair at exit 51 has good prices and short lines. Might want to top off there if you're running low. Desert Rose had been the call sign for Linda Thompson, who'd hauled fuel tankers across the Southwest until she died of a heart attack in her sleeper cab in 2020. Linda's knowledge of fuel stops and pricing had been encyclopedic, and she'd always been generous with sharing information that could save other drivers time and money. Westbound Convoy. This is Mountain Man, with a brake check reminder. That 6% grade coming up at mile marker 32 will cook your brakes if you're not careful. Drop it into low gear before you hit the steep section and use your engine brake to control speed. Mountain Man was Eddie Foster, who'd been hauling heavy equipment through mountain passes for 25 years before a mechanical failure sent his rig off a cliff in Montana. Eddie's expertise with mountain driving techniques had been legendary, and his safety reminders had probably prevented more accidents than anyone could calculate. Each voice provided accurate, current information about conditions they shouldn't have been able to observe. The fuel shortage at exit 47 was real. I confirmed it when I drove past and saw the no diesel signs posted on the pumps. The steep grade at mile marker 32 did require careful brake management, and following the advice probably prevented my brakes from overheating during the descent. But these drivers were all dead. I had clear memories of their accidents, their funerals, their families grieving at memorial services. Yet their voices continued, providing the same professional guidance they'd offered during their lifetimes, as if death had been just another route change rather than the end of their careers. The most unsettling transmission came as I approached the Nevada state line, where Echo Canyon opens into the broader valleys of the Great Basin. The radio crackled with a voice I hadn't heard in almost 15 years. My old driving partner and mentor, Frank Kowalski, who'd taught me everything I knew about safe mountain driving before dying in an avalanche-triggered accident in 2010. Big Bob, this is your old partner Frank. Been listening to you work your way through the canyon, and you're handling that heavy load real professional. Just wanted you to know that all us old-timers are still out here, still watching out for drivers, still trying to keep everyone safe on these roads. Frank's voice was exactly as I remembered it. Gravelly from years of cigarette smoking, warm with genuine affection, carrying the authority of someone who'd driven millions of miles without a serious accident. But Frank had been dead for 14 years, buried in a cemetery outside of Salt Lake City after an avalanche swept his truck off a mountain highway during a winter storm. Frank, is that really you? I've been hearing voices all morning. Drivers I know are dead. What's happening here? Don't know exactly, Bob. Just know that some of us can't quite let go of the road. We spent so many years looking out for each other, warning about dangers, sharing information that could save lives. Death doesn't seem to change that instinct. The road gets in your blood, and your blood stays on the road. His transmission faded into static, leaving me alone with normal CB chatter and the growing realization that Echo Canyon was somehow allowing communications between the living and the dead. The canyon walls that amplified radio signals were also amplifying something else: the dedication of professional drivers who couldn't stop working even after their shifts had ended permanently. I completed my delivery in Nevada and returned through Echo Canyon 2 days later with an empty trailer. The radio remained silent during the eastbound climb, except for normal traffic from living drivers, discussing fuel prices and weather forecasts. Whatever phenomenon had allowed me to hear those familiar voices seemed to be directional, affecting only westbound traffic during specific conditions. But since that morning in October, I've heard similar transmissions on other routes and during other trips. Always voices I recognize, always drivers I've known personally, always providing accurate information that could prevent accidents or save lives. The voices seem to appear most often during dangerous driving conditions, storms, mechanical failures, medical emergencies, as if the community of deceased drivers maintains a protective watch over those still working the highways. I've stopped trying to explain or rationalize these communications. Instead, I've learned to listen carefully and follow their guidance, treating the voices of dead drivers with the same respect I always showed their living expertise. Their information has helped me avoid accidents, navigate through severe weather, and make decisions that probably saved my life and the lives of other drivers. The CB radio in my truck carries more than just the voices of active drivers now. It carries the accumulated wisdom of everyone who ever shared information, offered warnings, or extended professional courtesy on America's highways. Some frequencies never go silent, and some drivers never really finish their final runs. Every time I drive through Echo Canyon, I listen for familiar voices providing guidance from beyond the grave. They're still out there, still working their routes, still taking care of drivers who are trying to make it home safely. Death, it seems, is just another stretch of highway, and some drivers keep on trucking no matter where the road takes them. Sometimes the hardest habit to break is talking to someone who's no longer listening. My name is Michael Chen, and I've been working as a dispatch coordinator for Interstate Freight Solutions for 8 years. I manage routing and schedules for our team driving operations pairs of drivers who share long-haul routes, taking turns at the wheel while their partner sleeps in the cab's rear berth. Team driving allows us to keep freight moving around the clock while maintaining safety regulations about mandatory rest periods. It's efficient, profitable, and safer than having single drivers push themselves beyond fatigue limits. Lisa Park had been one of our most reliable team drivers for 15 years. partnered with the same co-driver for most of that time. Steven Rodriguez and Lisa had developed the kind of professional relationship that makes team driving successful: synchronized schedules, compatible personalities, and absolute trust in each other's abilities. They could cover coast-to-coast routes in under 3 days, maintaining perfect safety records while delivering time-sensitive freight ahead of schedule. Steven and Lisa specialized in high-priority loads along the Interstate 95 corridor, hauling everything from electronics to pharmaceutical shipments between distribution centers from Miami to Boston. Their truck was equipped with a comfortable sleeper cab that allowed proper rest between driving shifts, and they'd perfected the rhythm of team operations, one driving while the other slept, switching positions every 8 to 10 hours with military precision. But in September of 2024, Steven decided to leave trucking entirely. His wife had been diagnosed with a serious illness, and he wanted to find local employment that would keep him home with his family. It was an understandable decision, but it left Lisa without a driving partner for the first time in over a decade. Finding compatible team driving partners isn't easy. Drivers need to trust each other completely, coordinate sleep schedules, and spend weeks at a time sharing the confined space of a truck cab. Many partnerships fail within the first few months due to personality conflicts, different driving styles, or incompatible living habits. Lisa had been fortunate to work with Steven for so long, and replacing that partnership would be challenging. After Steven's departure, Lisa requested to continue working, but as a single driver rather than waiting for us to find her a new partner. Single driver operations meant longer delivery times and mandatory rest stops. But Lisa was experienced enough to handle solo routes safely. We restructured her assignments to shorter regional runs that could be completed within legal driving time limits. However, within a few weeks of Lisa's transition to solo driving, I began receiving unusual reports from truck stops and way stations along her regular routes. Security personnel and other drivers reported that Lisa appeared to be talking to someone in her truck, even though company records showed she was driving alone. The reports described animated conversations, with Lisa responding to someone as if carrying on normal team driver communications. Initially, I assumed Lisa was using hands-free phone systems or CB radio communications during these observed conversations. Many single drivers maintain constant contact with family, dispatch, or other truckers to combat the isolation of solo driving. But when I reviewed her phone records and CB transmission logs, I found no corresponding communications during the times when she was observed talking to someone. The first detailed report came from a truck stop manager in Savannah, Georgia, who contacted our company with concerns about Lisa's behavior during a mandatory rest stop. According to the manager, Lisa had spent her entire 10-hour break period having conversations with someone in her sleeper cab, but security cameras showed no evidence of a second person in or around her truck. Your driver seemed to be having normal conversations with her co-driver, the manager explained during a phone call to our office. She was talking about route planning, delivery schedules, the usual stuff team drivers discuss. But our cameras show her truck from multiple angles, and she's definitely alone in there. We were concerned she might be having some kind of medical episode or psychological problem. I called Lisa directly to check on her well-being and ask about the reports. She seemed confused by my questions and insisted that everything was normal with her driving routine. When I mentioned that observers had seen her talking to someone while driving alone, she paused for a long moment before explaining that she sometimes talked to herself to stay alert during long drives. It's just a habit I developed from team driving, Michael. After 15 years of constant conversation with Steven, it feels strange to drive in complete silence. Sometimes I talk through route decisions or delivery procedures out loud. Maybe people are misinterpreting that as conversations with someone else. Her explanation seemed reasonable, and talking to oneself during long drives isn't uncommon among truckers. Many drivers use vocal exercises, sing along to music, or narrate their actions to maintain alertness during monotonous highway stretches. But over the following weeks, more reports came in from different locations along Lisa's routes, all describing the same pattern of behavior. A way station operator in South Carolina reported watching Lisa have what appeared to be a detailed conversation about load weights and axle configurations, pausing as if listening to responses before continuing to speak. A fuel island attendant in North Carolina described seeing Lisa gesture toward the sleeper cab while discussing delivery schedules and route changes with someone who wasn't visible. Most concerning was a report from a state trooper who had conducted a routine commercial vehicle inspection at a rest area. The trooper noted that Lisa had been conversing with her co-driver about inspection procedures throughout the entire process. But when he asked to speak with her partner, Lisa seemed confused and said she was driving alone. The trooper found no evidence of a second person in the truck, but noted that Lisa continued glancing toward the sleeper cab as if someone were present. I decided to review security footage from various truck stops to better understand what people were observing. Through our company's partnerships with major truck stop chains, I was able to access surveillance videos from several locations where Lisa had been reported having conversations with an invisible person. The footage was disturbing in its consistency. Video after video showed Lisa engaged in what appeared to be normal team driver conversations, pausing to listen, responding to questions, laughing at comments, and gesturing toward the sleeper cab as if someone were present. Her body language and facial expressions indicated genuine interaction with another person, but the camera angles clearly showed she was alone in the truck. In one particularly unsettling video from a truck stop in Fayetteville, Lisa could be seen sitting in the driver's seat with the cab door open, having an animated discussion about fuel efficiency and route optimization. She would pause, nod as if listening to detailed responses, and continue the conversation as if receiving input from an experienced co-driver. The discussion lasted nearly 20 minutes, with Lisa displaying all the conversational patterns of team driver communication, but no second voice could be heard on the audio, and no second person was visible in any camera angle. More troubling was Lisa's apparent expectation that others could see or hear her invisible co-driver. In several videos, she would gesture toward the sleeper cab while talking to truck stop employees, as if introducing them to her partner. She would pause during conversations, as if allowing her co-driver to speak, then continue responding to comments that only she could hear. I scheduled a face-to-face meeting with Lisa at our company headquarters, ostensibly to discuss her route assignments, but actually to evaluate her psychological state. During our conversation, Lisa seemed completely rational and professional when discussing logistics, delivery schedules, and truck maintenance. But when I asked about her transition to solo driving, she made several references to we and us when describing recent trips. "We've been making good time on the 95 runs," she said. "The new routing through the Pine Barrens saves us about 2 hours, compared to the coastal route. My partner thinks we should stick with that corridor even during peak traffic times." When I pointed out that she was driving alone now, Lisa looked genuinely confused for a moment before correcting herself. "Sorry, old habits. I meant I've been making good time. It's hard to adjust to solo driving after 15 years of team operations. Sometimes I forget that Steven isn't back there anymore." But throughout our meeting, Lisa occasionally glanced over her shoulder as if checking with someone, and twice she paused in mid-sentence as if listening to input from another person. When I asked directly if she felt she was still driving with a partner, she insisted she understood she was working alone, but admitted that the sleeper cab didn't feel empty. "It's probably just psychological adjustment," she said. "That space behind me was occupied for so long, it feels strange to have it empty. Sometimes I hear sounds shifting cargo, settling upholstery, normal truck noises, and my brain interprets them as Steven moving around back there. It's nothing I can't handle." However, the reports from other locations continued to suggest something beyond normal psychological adjustment. A truck stop security guard in Jacksonville called to report that he'd observed Lisa having what appeared to be an argument with someone in her sleeper cab, with raised voices and animated gestures that suggested a heated disagreement about route choices. But audio surveillance picked up only Lisa's voice, and thermal imaging showed only one heat signature in the truck. The most disturbing incident occurred 3 weeks later at a rest area in the Georgia Pine Barrens, a desolate stretch of Interstate 95, where Lisa often stopped during her regular routes. A state trooper conducting routine patrols found Lisa's truck parked legally in the commercial vehicle area, but Lisa was nowhere to be found. Her truck was idling normally. Her personal belongings were undisturbed, and her logbook showed she'd been taking a mandatory rest break. The trooper searched the immediate area and found Lisa about a quarter mile into the woods, walking alone among the pine trees and talking animatedly to someone who wasn't there. When the trooper approached, Lisa seemed surprised to see him and confused about her location. "I was just talking with my co-driver about taking a walk to stretch our legs," she explained. "We've been sitting in the truck for hours and the woods looked peaceful. I didn't realize I'd walked so far from the parking area." The trooper escorted Lisa back to her truck and suggested she contact her company about the incident. In his report, he noted that Lisa had seemed genuinely confused about being found alone in the woods, and that she continued glancing around as if expecting to see someone else throughout their conversation. When Lisa called to report the incident, she described it as a simple misunderstanding. She'd taken a walk to get some exercise and had gotten disoriented among the similar-looking pine trees. But her explanation didn't account for why witnesses had observed her talking to someone throughout the walk, or why she'd seemed surprised to be alone when the trooper found her. "I made the difficult decision to remove Lisa from active duty, pending a complete medical evaluation. Our company couldn't risk the safety implications of having a driver who might be experiencing psychological episodes while operating commercial vehicles." Lisa accepted the decision professionally, but during our final conversation, she made a comment that stayed with me long after she'd left the office. "I know you think I'm having problems adjusting to solo driving," she said, "but I want you to understand that the sleeper cab isn't empty. Stephen might not be physically there anymore, but everything we shared during 15 years of team driving, all the conversations, all the shared experiences, all the trust we built, that doesn't just disappear because he took a different job. Some partnerships leave marks that don't fade just because the paperwork changes." Lisa never returned to driving for our company. The medical evaluation found no evidence of psychological disorders or cognitive impairment, but the pattern of reported incidents made it impossible to reinstate her commercial driving privileges. She found work in logistics coordination, helping other team drivers plan routes and schedules from behind a desk rather than behind the wheel. But sometimes, when I'm working late shifts in the dispatch office, I hear reports from other drivers about a woman in a truck who seems to be talking to someone in her sleeper cab. The descriptions match Lisa's truck and her appearance, but according to our records, she hasn't been on the road for months. Other drivers report seeing her at truck stops or rest areas, always engaged in conversation with someone who isn't visible to anyone else. The trucking community has its own stories about drivers who can't quite let go of the road, and partners who refuse to be separated even when circumstances change. Maybe Lisa found a way to keep driving with Stephen, following routes that exist only for teams that refuse to be broken up by ordinary limitations, like employment changes or physical presence. Some partnerships, it seems, are strong enough to transcend the boundaries between what is and what was, creating their own reality where the conversation never has to end. Some reflections show you things that cast no shadows, following roads that lead nowhere but down. My name is Vincent Torres, and I've been specializing in mountain route trucking through the Colorado Rockies for 19 years. Interstate 70 between Denver and Grand Junction is my regular territory, one of the most challenging stretches of highway in the continental United States, with grades that exceed 6%, curves that can roll a trailer at normal highway speeds, and elevation changes that can destroy brakes and engines if you don't respect the mountain. It's dangerous work that requires absolute attention to detail, perfect equipment maintenance, and the kind of experience that only comes from driving millions of miles through terrain that doesn't forgive mistakes. Mountain trucking isn't for everyone. The grades are steep enough to cook brake systems. The weather can change from clear skies to blizzard conditions in minutes, and the isolation means that mechanical failures or accidents can leave you stranded for hours before help arrives. But I've always found something peaceful about driving through the high country, especially during overnight runs, when the mountain highways empty out and you can focus entirely on the relationship between your truck, the road, and the landscape. My regular route involves hauling construction equipment and mining supplies from distribution centers in Denver to job sites throughout western Colorado. The loads are heavy, often pushing the legal weight limits, which means I have to be especially careful on the steep descents that drop thousands of feet over relatively short distances. Proper brake management becomes critical. Too much reliance on service brakes will overheat them and cause brake fade, while improper use of engine brakes can cause loss of traction on steep grades. During winter months, I often drive overnight to avoid daytime traffic and minimize the risk of getting caught in mountain storms during peak travel hours. The highways are usually clear at night, with good visibility and minimal interference from other vehicles. It's solitary work, but I've always preferred the focus and concentration that comes with navigating challenging terrain without distractions. On December 3, 2024, I was making a routine westbound run with a load of mining equipment destined for a site near Glenwood Springs. The weather was clear and cold, with good road conditions and light traffic. I'd started the trip around 11 p.m., planning to complete the mountain crossing during overnight hours and arrive at the delivery site early the next morning. Around midnight, as I began the descent from the Eisenhower Tunnel toward the Dillon Reservoir, I noticed brake lights in my mirrors that seemed to be following at a consistent distance behind me. The lights appeared to belong to another commercial vehicle, maintaining proper following distance and matching my speed as I downshifted for the steep grade. At first, I was pleased to see another professional driver using proper mountain descent techniques. Too many truckers ride their brakes on steep grades, creating hazardous conditions for themselves and other traffic. The truck behind me seemed to be using engine braking and controlled speed management, exactly the techniques that prevent runaway truck accidents. But as the descent continued, something about the following vehicle began to feel wrong. The brake lights maintained absolutely perfect spacing, never getting closer during my speed reductions, never falling behind when I accelerated slightly. Most drivers vary their following distance slightly as they adjust to changing road conditions, but these lights held position with mechanical precision. More unsettling was the fact that the lights appeared only in my mirrors. When I tried to observe the following truck directly, by checking over my shoulder or adjusting my mirrors for better visibility, I couldn't get a clear view of the vehicle itself. I could see the brake lights clearly reflected in both side mirrors, but the actual truck casting those lights remained somehow invisible or out of focus. I tried adjusting my speed to see how the following vehicle would respond. When I slowed down for a sharp curve, the brake lights in my mirrors brightened immediately, indicating the driver was also reducing speed. When I accelerated slightly on a straightaway, the lights dimmed as the following driver presumably eased off his brakes. But the spacing never changed, as if the other truck were somehow tethered to mine at a fixed distance. After about 20 miles of descent, I decided to pull over at a chain-up area to let the following truck pass and get a better look at the driver. As I slowed and activated my turn signal, the brake lights in my mirrors also indicated a turn toward the chain-up area, suggesting the other driver was also planning to stop. But when I completed my stop and looked back toward the highway, no other truck was visible. The chain-up area was empty except for my rig, and traffic on Interstate 70 was light enough that I could see for miles in both directions. The brake lights that had been following me for 20 miles had simply disappeared. I spent about 10 minutes at the chain-up area, checking my truck's brake system and trying to rationalize what I'd observed. Mountain driving can create optical illusions, especially at night when depth perception becomes difficult, and multiple light sources can create confusing reflections. I decided that I'd probably been seeing reflected lights from oncoming traffic or distant vehicles on parallel roads. But when I resumed my descent toward Vale Pass, the brake lights reappeared in my mirrors within minutes, maintaining the same perfect following distance and responsive behavior. This time, I tried using my CB radio to contact the following driver. Eastbound truck following the Peterbilt with construction equipment. This is Vincent Torres. You've been staying pretty close back there. Want to coordinate our descent speeds? No response on Channel 19 or on any of the other channels commonly used by truckers in the Colorado mountains. I tried several more times to establish radio contact, but the following driver never acknowledged my transmissions. Over the next hour, as I continued the descent through some of the most challenging sections of Interstate 70, the brake lights became a constant presence in my mirrors. They responded to every speed change, every curve, every grade variation with perfect timing and appropriate intensity. But they remained impossible to observe directly, existing only as reflections that seemed to have no source. Around 3 a.m., as I approached the steepest section of the descent near Georgetown, something changed in the behavior of the lights behind me. Instead of simply responding to my driving, they began to anticipate my actions. The brake lights would brighten slightly before I began reducing speed for curves, as if the following driver knew the road better than I did and was preparing for hazards before they became visible. This anticipatory behavior was both helpful and deeply unsettling. The lights would warn me about sharp curves or steep grades by brightening before I could see the warning signs, allowing me to prepare for difficult sections of road. But their advanced knowledge of the route suggested that whoever was following me had driven this highway many times before, perhaps more times than should be possible. The most disturbing moment came as I approached the infamous Georgetown Hill, a section of highway with a 6% grade that has been the site of numerous runaway truck accidents over the years. As I began engine braking for the descent, the brake lights behind me began flashing in a pattern that seemed urgent and warning-like. I slowed more than usual, using maximum engine braking and gentle service brake applications. About halfway down the grade, I encountered a patch of black ice that was nearly invisible in my headlights. Without the extra caution prompted by the flashing brake lights, I might have hit that ice patch at a dangerous speed and lost control of my loaded truck. The brake lights had somehow warned me about a road hazard that they shouldn't have been able to see, helping me avoid what could have been a fatal accident. But their advanced knowledge of dangerous conditions raised questions about who was driving the invisible truck and how they possessed such detailed knowledge of road conditions ahead of my position. As dawn approached and I completed the mountain descent, the brake lights began to fade in my mirrors, becoming dimmer and less distinct as the sky lightened. By the time I reached Grand Junction around 7 a.m., they had disappeared entirely, leaving me to complete the final portion of my journey alone. I delivered my load on schedule and spent my mandatory rest period trying to understand what I'd experienced during the overnight mountain crossing. The logical explanation was that I'd been seeing optical illusions created by fatigue, multiple light sources, and the challenging visibility conditions common to mountain driving. But the helpful behavior of the lights, their warnings about road hazards and dangerous conditions, suggested something more than random reflections. 3 days later, while deadheading back to Denver, I stopped at a truck stop in Silverthorne and struck up a conversation with other drivers who regularly work the mountain routes. When I mentioned the brake lights I'd been seeing in my mirrors, one of the older drivers nodded with recognition. "You're not the first driver to mention something like that on the 70 corridor," he said. "Been hearing stories for years about truckers seeing lights in their mirrors during mountain descents. Always the same pattern, perfect following distance, responsive to your driving, but no actual truck visible when you look for it directly. He paused, studying my face. Heard some drivers say the lights help them avoid accidents, warn them about dangerous conditions they wouldn't see otherwise. Like something's watching out for mountain drivers, making sure they get down those grades safely. Another driver joined our conversation, mentioning that he'd seen my truck during a westbound run a few nights earlier. According to him, I'd been followed by another truck, maintaining perfect spacing, but when he tried to get a better look at the following vehicle, it seemed to fade away as he observed it. Looked like a classic rig, maybe from the 80s or 90s, he said. Older style headlights and marker lights, but kept perfect formation behind you all the way down Georgetown Hill. Disappeared right around sunrise, like it just faded away with the darkness. I've made dozens of mountain runs since that December night, and the brake lights continue to appear during challenging descents. They're always there when conditions are dangerous during snowstorms, ice events, or when my load is particularly heavy and requires extra caution. The lights provide warnings about road hazards, help me maintain safe speeds, and seem to guide me through the most difficult sections of mountain highway. Other drivers have confirmed seeing my truck followed by a phantom vehicle that disappears at dawn, but I've never been able to identify the driver or determine the source of the protective presence. The brake lights exist only as reflections, helping mountain truckers navigate dangerous terrain while remaining invisible to direct observation. I've stopped trying to make radio contact or identify the source of the lights. Instead, I've learned to trust their guidance and appreciate their warnings about dangerous conditions ahead. Some reflections, it seems, show you exactly what you need to see, even when what you're seeing shouldn't exist. The mountains have their own way of taking care of drivers who respect their dangers, and sometimes that care comes in forms that can't be explained, only experienced and gratefully accepted. Some people never quite finish their shift, even when their time clock stops forever. My name is Patricia Williams, and I've been an owner-operator for 17 years, hauling freight across the Southwest in my 2018 Kenworth. I specialize in long-distance runs between California and Texas, covering the same routes month after month until every truck stop, every way station, and every mile marker becomes as familiar as the dashboard in my cab. The Interstate 10 corridor through West Texas is my bread and butter, 800 miles of mostly straight highway, where you can make good time if you know the roads, respect the law, and maintain good relationships with the people who keep the transportation system running. Way stations are a fact of life for commercial drivers. We're required to stop at open facilities to verify that our gross weight and axle loads comply with federal and state regulations. Most stations operate with automated systems. Now you pull onto the scale, wait for the green light, and continue on your way if everything checks out. But some facilities still employ attendants who can handle special situations, provide assistance with paperwork, or address problems that automated systems can't resolve. The way station at mile marker 412 on Interstate 10, about 60 miles east of El Paso, had always been one of my regular stops. It's positioned at exactly the right point in my usual route to check my weight after picking up loads in Southern California, and the facility is modern and well-maintained. More importantly, it was staffed by one of the most helpful and professional attendants I'd ever encountered in 17 years of driving. Ed Martinez had been working that way station for as long as I'd been running the Texas routes. He was probably in his late 50s, with graying hair, a friendly smile, and the kind of professional competence that made even routine inspections pleasant rather than stressful. Ed knew the regulations inside and out, could spot potential problems before they became violations, and always took time to help drivers understand complex weight distribution requirements. But what made Ed special wasn't just his technical knowledge, it was his genuine interest in the drivers who stopped at his station. He remembered regular customers, asked about families and health issues, and celebrated professional milestones like accident-free anniversaries or new equipment purchases. Ed treated every driver with respect and courtesy, understanding that we were just trying to do our jobs safely and legally. Morning, Patricia. How's that Kenworth treating you today? Still getting good fuel economy with the new engine? Running like a dream, Ed. Just picked up a load of electronics in Los Angeles heading to Houston. Should be right on weight limits if my calculations are correct. Let's get you on the scale. And make sure. You've always been good with your weight calculations, but it never hurts to verify. Better to catch problems here than at a roadside inspection 50 miles down the highway. These conversations became a comfortable part of my routine over the years. Ed's station was always a pleasant stop where I could verify my legal compliance, get professional advice about load distribution, and enjoy a few minutes of friendly conversation during otherwise solitary long-haul runs. Ed had an encyclopedic knowledge of weight regulations, safety requirements, and the technical aspects of commercial vehicle operation. He could diagnose potential problems by observing how a truck moved across the scale, suggest adjustments to load positioning, and explain complex regulations in terms that made sense to working drivers. More than once, his advice had saved me from expensive violations or prevented equipment problems that could have left me stranded. In early November of 2024, I was running behind schedule due to delays at the pickup location and decided to push through to Houston without my usual overnight rest. This meant passing through Ed's way station around 2 a.m. instead of my normal mid-morning timing. I was concerned that the station might be closed or operating with reduced staff during overnight hours. But as I approached the facility, I could see lights in the inspection building and the familiar figure of Ed Martinez at his station. Even at 2 in the morning, he was maintaining the same professional standards and friendly demeanor that I'd experienced during hundreds of previous stops. Well, look who's running the graveyard shift tonight. How are you doing, Patricia? This is pretty late for you to be passing through here. Running behind schedule, Ed. Had to wait 4 hours for my load to be ready in Los Angeles, and I'm trying to make up time. Hope it's not a problem stopping here so late. Never a problem for regular customers. Let's get you weighed and back on the road. You look tired though. Make sure you're staying alert out there. These desert highways can be hypnotic during overnight runs. Ed processed my way station stop with his usual efficiency and attention to detail, checking my permits, verifying my weight distribution, and providing helpful reminders about upcoming construction zones and weather conditions. Everything proceeded exactly as it had during hundreds of previous interactions, except for the unusual timing. But as I prepared to leave the way station, something about the interaction began to feel strange. Ed's appearance seemed slightly less distinct than usual, as if he were standing in dimmer lighting or viewed through imperfect glass. His voice had the same warm tone and professional competence, but it seemed to come from slightly farther away than his visible position suggested. Most unsettling was the fact that the way station building appeared to be operating with minimal lighting. Only Ed's immediate workspace was brightly illuminated, while the rest of the facility remained dark. During previous daytime stops, the entire building had been well lit and obviously active with multiple staff members and normal business operations. I attributed these observations to fatigue and the disorienting effects of driving through the night. Overnight shifts often make familiar places seem different, and the unusual timing of my stop could easily explain why the facility was operating with reduced lighting and staffing. Over the next few months, I made several more late-night passes through Ed's way station, always finding him on duty despite the unusual hours. Each interaction followed the same pattern: professional service, friendly conversation, and helpful advice, but always with that slightly surreal quality that seemed to accompany overnight encounters. In March of 2025, equipment problems forced me to make a daytime stop at the way station for the first time in several months. I arrived around 11 a.m., expecting to find Ed at his usual post and hoping to get help with a load distribution issue that was causing handling problems. But when I pulled onto the scale, no attendant appeared. The weigh station was operating in fully automated mode, with electronic signs directing drivers through the weighing process and digital displays showing weight readings. I waited several minutes for Ed to appear, assuming he might be handling paperwork or assisting another driver. When no attendant materialized, I walked to the weigh station office to look for Ed or inquire about getting help with my load distribution problem. The office was empty, with dust on the desks and outdated paperwork scattered around as if the space hadn't been used in years. A sign near the entrance explained that the weigh station had been converted to fully automated operation in 2015 as part of a statewide efficiency initiative. All weighing, permit verification, and routine inspections were now handled by computerized systems, with human attendants available only for special enforcement actions or complex violations. Confused and concerned, I used my cell phone to call the number listed for the weigh station's parent office, hoping to speak with a supervisor who could explain the discrepancy between the automated system and my recent interactions with Ed Martinez. The supervisor I reached seemed puzzled by my questions about Ed Martinez and the attendant services I'd been receiving. According to his records, the weigh station had been fully automated for nearly 10 years, with no human staff assigned to routine operations. Ma'am, I'm not sure where you got the name Ed Martinez, but that position was eliminated when we automated the facility. We do have enforcement officers who respond to the station when there are violations or special circumstances, but no full-time attendants have worked there since 2015. When I described my recent interactions with Ed, including specific conversations and the professional advice he'd provided, the supervisor went quiet for several moments before asking me to hold while he checked historical employment records. Patricia, this is concerning. We did have an attendant named Ed Martinez who worked at that station for many years before automation, but Ed died of a heart attack at his desk in January of 2016. There must be some mistake about who you've been talking to. The supervisor's words hit me like a physical blow. Ed Martinez, the helpful and professional attendant who'd been providing service and advice during my recent late-night stops, had been dead for over 8 years. Yet I had clear, detailed memories of conversations, professional interactions, and helpful advice that had occurred just months earlier. That evening, I drove back to the weigh station, arriving around the same time as my previous late-night stops. The facility was dark, except for the automated scale systems, with no signs of human presence or activity. The office that had always been brightly lit during my interactions with Ed was clearly empty and unused. But as I sat in my truck, looking at the darkened weigh station, I began to understand something that made my hands shake, despite the warm desert air. Ed Martinez hadn't stopped working when he died. He'd simply continued providing the same professional service he'd always offered, helping drivers navigate regulations and maintain safety standards, even after his shift had officially ended. I never stopped at that weigh station late at night again. During daytime hours, the automated systems handle weight verification efficiently, but I've learned not to trust services that should no longer exist. Other drivers have mentioned seeing lights in the weigh station office during overnight passes, and some have reported receiving helpful advice from an attendant who seems friendly and knowledgeable but somehow difficult to see clearly. The trucking community has its own stories about people who were so dedicated to their work that death couldn't convince them to retire. Ed Martinez was one of those people, a professional who understood that helping drivers wasn't just a job, it was a calling that continued even when the paycheck stopped coming. Sometimes, when I'm driving through West Texas late at night, I see lights in that weigh station office and remember the friendly voice that always knew exactly what advice I needed to hear. Some people finish their work and move on. Others never quite figure out how to clock out, continuing to serve long after their time should have ended. Some highways hold on to the last words ever spoken on them. playing them back for anyone willing to listen through the static. My name is Gregory Walsh, and I've been hauling grain across the northern tier states for 24 years. Highway 2 through the Montana Highline is my regular route, a lonely stretch of two-lane road that runs parallel to the Canadian border for over 600 miles, connecting small farming communities scattered across one of the most sparsely populated regions in the continental United States. It's honest work, moving wheat, barley, and corn from grain elevators to processing facilities, but it requires patience for the long drives through country where you might not see another vehicle for an hour at a time. The Highline gets its name from being the northernmost east-west highway in Montana, following the route of the old Great Northern Railway across endless wheat fields and cattle ranches. During harvest season, I'll make the run from Havre to Wolf Point 3 or 4 times a week, hauling grain in a 40-foot hopper trailer behind my 2020 Peterbilt. It's a 12-hour round trip through landscape that changes very little, mile after mile rolling prairie, scattered farmsteads, and the occasional small town with a grain elevator rising like a cathedral above the wheat fields. The isolation can be challenging, especially during overnight runs when the highway becomes entirely empty, except for the occasional rancher heading home late or another trucker making a similar haul. CB radio becomes essential company during those long stretches, providing weather updates, road condition reports, and the kind of casual conversation that helps pass the miles. Channel 19 carries voices from truckers scattered across hundreds of square miles, creating an invisible community of drivers, sharing information and companionship across the loneliest highways in America. During winter months, I often make overnight runs to avoid the heaviest winds that can make driving a loaded grain truck dangerous during daylight hours. The Highline is notorious for ground blizzards that can reduce visibility to 0 in minutes, and crosswinds that can push a high-sided trailer off the road without warning. Night driving usually means calmer conditions and better visibility, even though it means covering those empty miles in complete solitude. On February 8, 2025, I was making a routine eastbound run from Havre to Glasgow, hauling wheat to a processing facility near Fort Peck Lake. The weather was clear and cold, with good road conditions and light winds. I'd started the trip around 11 p.m., planning to complete the delivery before dawn and return empty during daylight hours. Around mile marker 215, about halfway between Chester and Shelby, my CB radio began picking up what sounded like distress calls, mixed with heavy static. The transmissions were fragmented and difficult to understand, but they clearly involved truckers calling for emergency assistance. Mayday, Mayday. This is eastbound trucker at mile marker 215. We got a rollover situation here. Trailer's on its side. Can't get out of the cab. Need emergency response right away. The voice was urgent and frightened, cutting through static with the kind of desperation that comes from genuine, life-threatening situations. I immediately grabbed my CB handset to respond and coordinate emergency assistance. Trucker calling Mayday at 215. This is Gregory Walsh, in a grain truck about 2 miles from your position. I can see your location, and I'm pulling over to assist. Do you have injuries? Are you trapped in your vehicle? But as I approached mile marker 215, scanning both sides of the highway for signs of an accident, I found nothing. The road was clear, with no vehicles, no skid marks, no debris, and no evidence that any kind of rollover had occurred. The distress calls had gone silent exactly as I reached the mile marker location. I spent nearly 30 minutes searching the area, checking fence lines and ditches for any signs of an accident that might not be visible from the highway. I tried repeatedly to raise the driver on CB radio, but channel 19 had returned to normal static with no response to my calls. Confused, but unable to find any evidence of an actual emergency, I resumed my trip toward Glasgow. About 20 miles further east, near Shelby, my radio again crackled with distress calls emerging from static. Emergency. Emergency. This is a grain truck eastbound at mile marker 236. We got black ice here. Trucks jackknifed across both lanes. Drivers unconscious. bleeding from the head. We need ambulance and fire department response immediately. Again, the voice carried absolute authenticity, the kind of professional urgency that experienced truckers use when reporting genuine emergencies. I responded immediately, offering assistance and asking for more details about the driver's condition and the exact location of the accident. But as I reached mile marker 236, the same pattern repeated. No accident, no vehicles, no evidence of any emergency situation. The distress calls cut to silence exactly as I passed the mile marker, leaving only normal CB static and the sound of my own engine. Over the next 4 hours, as I completed my run to Glasgow and began the return trip, the pattern continued with disturbing consistency. At specific mile markers along Highway 2, my CB radio would pick up emergency calls from truckers, reporting accidents, mechanical failures, medical emergencies, and weather-related disasters. Each transmission sounded completely authentic, with specific details about locations, cargo types, and injury descriptions that suggested genuine emergency situations. But every call would go silent exactly as I reached the reported location, and I never found any physical evidence of the emergencies being described. The highway remained empty and clear, with no signs that accidents had ever occurred at those locations. Most unsettling was the consistency of the mile marker locations. The distress calls always originated from the same spots along the highway: 215, 236, 264, 287, and 309. Each location would generate the same type of emergency call during every trip, as if the highway itself were broadcasting recorded distress signals at predetermined points. Around 4 a.m., as I approached mile marker 309 on my westbound return trip, the radio crackled with the most disturbing transmission yet. "This is Gregory Walsh in a grain truck, westbound at mile marker 309. We got a medical emergency here. Driver's having chest pains, can't breathe properly, think it might be a heart attack. Need immediate medical response. This is a real emergency." The voice was unmistakably my own, reporting an emergency involving myself at the exact location I was approaching. But I felt fine, with no chest pains or breathing difficulties. The transmission was my voice, my call sign, and my exact location, but I wasn't making the call. I grabbed my CB handset, intending to respond to what appeared to be my own distress call, but the transmission cut to silence exactly as I reached mile marker 309. The highway ahead remained empty, with no evidence of any emergency situation involving myself or any other driver. The experience of hearing my own voice calling for help was deeply unsettling in ways I couldn't rationalize. The transmission had contained details about my truck, my cargo, and my physical condition that were accurate, but shouldn't have been known to anyone else. Yet the emergency being described wasn't happening, despite the authenticity of the distress call. I completed my return trip to Havre in uncomfortable silence, avoiding CB radio communications and trying to understand what I'd experienced during the overnight run. The logical explanations, atmospheric conditions causing radio signals to bounce across long distances, or recordings of old emergency calls being rebroadcast somehow, didn't account for the precision of the mile marker locations or the specific details in each distress call. The next day, I contacted the Montana Highway Patrol to ask about accident histories at the mile markers where I'd heard emergency calls. The dispatcher I spoke with was initially reluctant to provide specific information, but eventually confirmed that all 5 locations had been sites of fatal trucking accidents over the past 15 years. Mile marker 215, rollover accident in 2012. Driver killed when his grain truck overturned during high winds. Mile marker 236, jackknife accident in 2015. Driver died from head injuries after hitting black ice. Mile marker 264, mechanical failure in 2018. Driver killed when his brakes failed on a downgrade. Mile marker 287, weather-related accident in 2020. Driver died in a blizzard-related collision. Mile marker 309. Medical emergency. In 2023, driver died of a heart attack while pulled over on the shoulder. Each accident matched the emergency calls I'd heard, down to specific details about cargo types, injury descriptions, and weather conditions. The distress calls weren't random radio chatter. They were the final transmissions from drivers who had died at those exact locations, somehow preserved and rebroadcast through atmospheric conditions that I couldn't understand. Most disturbing was the realization that the emergency call involving my own voice had come from mile marker 309, where a grain hauler had died of a heart attack just 2 years earlier. The transmission suggested that someday, at that exact location, I would be making my own final distress call. I've continued hauling grain along Highway 2, but I no longer listen to CB radio during overnight runs through the High Line. The highway holds too many voices, too many final words from drivers who never completed their journeys home. Some frequencies carry more than just communication. They carry the last desperate moments of people who died alone on empty highways, still calling for help that will never come. The Montana High Line is 600 miles of the loneliest road in America, and every mile marker has stories that most people will never hear. But for those willing to listen through the static, the voices are still there, still calling, still hoping that someone might finally answer their emergency calls. Some people take such pride in their work that dying at their workbench doesn't stop them from finishing the job. My name is Samuel Rodriguez, and I've been driving maintenance-heavy specialty equipment across the Central States for 13 years. I haul oversized loads, construction machinery, industrial equipment, and agricultural implements that require specialized trailers and constant mechanical attention. The nature of my cargo means I'm always dealing with equipment problems, hydraulic leaks, electrical issues, bearing problems, and the 1,000 other mechanical failures that come with moving massive machinery down highways that weren't designed for such loads. The TA Travel Center at Interstate 35 in Oklahoma, just south of Oklahoma City, became my regular maintenance stop about 4 years ago. It's positioned perfectly for my typical routes between Texas and Kansas, and the facility has a full-service truck maintenance shop that stays open 24 hours to serve drivers who can't afford extended downtime. More importantly, it's staffed by mechanics who understand the unique challenges of maintaining specialty hauling equipment. The maintenance shop has 8 service bays, each equipped with heavy-duty lifts, compressed air systems, and the specialized tools needed for commercial truck repair. Most bays handle routine maintenance during day shifts, but Bay 7 operates differently. It's dedicated to emergency repairs and complex problems that require extended work periods. Bay 7 runs overnight shifts because that's when most drivers discover serious problems and need immediate repairs to stay on schedule. I'd been using Bay 7 exclusively since discovering it during a hydraulic emergency in 2021. The bay was staffed by a mechanic, everyone called Old Pete, a man probably in his late 60s, with decades of experience and an encyclopedic knowledge of truck maintenance. Pete could diagnose problems by listening to engine sounds, identify hydraulic leaks by examining stains, and fabricate temporary repairs that would keep equipment running until permanent fixes could be completed. Pete worked alone during overnight shifts, handling complex repairs that would require teams of mechanics during daytime operations. He had a methodical approach to problem solving and never rushed jobs, understanding that hasty repairs on specialized equipment could lead to catastrophic failures during transport. More importantly, Pete never charged for minor fixes replacing blown fuses, tightening loose connections, topping off fluid levels, treating these services as professional courtesy rather than billable labor. Sounds like your air compressor governor's sticking, Sam. Probably just needs a good cleaning and adjustment. I'll take care of it while I'm working on your hydraulic leak. No charge for small stuff like that, just part of keeping you safe on the road. Pete's approach to customer service was old-school professional, focused on solving problems completely rather than maximizing labor charges. He'd often discover additional issues while working on primary repairs and fix them without being asked, understanding that preventing future breakdowns was more valuable than generating return business through incomplete repairs. Over 3 years of regular visits to Bay 7, Pete and I developed the kind of comfortable working relationship that makes truck maintenance less stressful. He knew my equipment, understood my typical routes and delivery schedules, and could anticipate problems before they became serious failures. Pete's preventive maintenance advice had probably saved me thousands of dollars in major repairs and prevented costly delays during time-sensitive deliveries. That fifth wheel needs greasing more often with the loads you're pulling, Sam. I can see some wear patterns that suggest it's not getting proper lubrication. Let me take care of it tonight, and you should plan on servicing it every 15,000 miles instead of waiting for the standard intervals. Pete's knowledge extended beyond basic mechanical skills to understanding how different types of cargo affected equipment wear patterns. He could examine trailer components and predict which parts would fail next, allowing me to schedule repairs proactively rather than dealing with roadside breakdowns. In November of 2024, I stopped at Bay 7 around midnight with a recurring electrical problem that was causing intermittent trailer lighting failures. Pete diagnosed the issue as corroded connections in the trailer's wiring harness and spent nearly 4 hours replacing damaged sections and waterproofing vulnerable connections. As usual, Pete refused to charge for several additional services he'd performed during the repair process: cleaning battery terminals, checking belt tensions, and adjusting mirror positions that had become loose from road vibrations. When I tried to leave a cash tip to acknowledge his extra effort and professional competence, Pete smiled and waved away the money. "Just doing my job, Sam. Take care of that equipment, and it'll take care of you." That's payment enough for an old mechanic who likes to see things done right. Pete's humility and work ethic were remarkable even by the standards of professional truck mechanics, most of whom take genuine pride in their skills and customer service. But Pete seemed to view excellent service not as something deserving special recognition, but as the basic standard that professional mechanics should always maintain. 3 weeks later, I returned to Bay 7 with a hydraulic problem that was causing my trailer's loading ramps to operate sluggishly. I arrived around 1 a.m., expecting to find Pete at his usual workstation, and was surprised to discover Bay 7 apparently empty and unlit. I walked around the service area looking for Pete or another mechanic who could handle overnight repairs, eventually finding a night supervisor in the main office who seemed confused by my request for service in Bay 7. "Bay 7? We don't have anyone working Bay 7 on night shifts anymore. Haven't had overnight mechanics in that bay for several years now. You might be thinking of one of the other bays. Or maybe you need to wait until day shift starts at 6 a.m. I explained that I'd been getting regular service in Bay 7 from Pete for over 3 years, describing his appearance and mentioning specific repairs he'd completed. The supervisor's expression shifted from confusion to something that looked like concern. "Hold on a minute. You," said Pete. "Can you describe this mechanic more specifically?" When I provided details about Pete's appearance, age, and working style, the supervisor asked me to wait while he checked some records in his office computer system. After several minutes, he returned with a printed employee file and a photograph that clearly showed the mechanic I knew as Pete. "This is Pete Henderson. He worked Bay 7 for almost 20 years, did overnight emergency repairs just like you described. But Pete died in 2019. Had a heart attack right there at his workbench in Bay 7. Found him the next morning when the day shift came in." The supervisor's words didn't immediately register as real. I had clear, recent memories of detailed conversations with Pete, professional interactions that had occurred just weeks earlier. I could recall specific repairs, technical discussions, and the distinctive way Pete approached complex mechanical problems. That's impossible. I talked to Pete 3 weeks ago. He spent 4 hours working on my trailer wiring system, gave me advice about preventive maintenance schedules. He can't have been dead for 5 years. The supervisor showed me the photograph from Pete's personnel file. It was unmistakably the same man who'd been servicing my equipment. The employment records showed Pete Henderson had worked overnight shifts in Bay 7 from 2004 until his death on November 15, 2019. The cause of death was listed as cardiac arrest, and witnesses reported that he'd been found slumped over his workbench with tools still in his hands. Sir, I don't know who you've been talking to, but Pete Henderson has been dead for over 5 years. Bay 7 has been used for storage. Since then, we've had some drivers report strange experiences in that area, so we just keep it closed during overnight hours. I insisted on seeing Bay 7 immediately, hoping to find some evidence that Pete was still working there, or some explanation for the discrepancy between my experiences and the official records. The supervisor reluctantly accompanied me to the maintenance area, unlocking Bay 7 with keys he seemed hesitant to use. Bay 7 was dark and obviously unused, with dust-covered equipment and work surfaces that showed no signs of recent activity. The workbench, where I'd watched Pete diagnose countless mechanical problems, was covered with a tarp, and the tool cabinets that had always been organized and well-maintained were locked and clearly hadn't been opened in years. But as I stood in that empty service bay, trying to reconcile what I was seeing with my memories of Pete's professional service, I noticed something that made my hands shake, despite the warm Oklahoma night. The workbench under the tarp still held the impression of someone who had worked there regularly, worn spots where elbows had rested, oil stains in patterns that suggested habitual use, and scratch marks from tools that had been used with the kind of frequency that comes from years of dedicated work. More unsettling was a small calendar beside the workbench, open to November 2019, and marked with Pete's handwriting noting scheduled maintenance appointments. The last entry was dated November 15th, the night Pete Henderson had died at that workbench, apparently while planning future repairs for customers who would never receive his services. Sam, I need to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. When you've been talking to Pete during your visits here, has anyone else seen him? Have other drivers or mechanics mentioned seeing him in Bay 7? I realized that during all my interactions with Pete, I'd never encountered other customers or mechanics in Bay 7. Pete had always been alone, working on my equipment with the kind of focused attention that suggested Bay 7 was exclusively dedicated to my repairs. I'd assumed this was because of the specialized nature of my equipment, but now I wondered if there was a more disturbing explanation. That night, I drove to a different truck stop for repairs, but I couldn't stop thinking about Pete Henderson and the service bay where he'd spent his final moments. Over the following weeks, I made several calls to other drivers who used the TA facility, asking if they'd ever encountered Pete or received service in Bay 7. The responses were consistent and unsettling. Several drivers mentioned seeing lights in Bay 7 during overnight hours and hearing the sounds of mechanical work, air tools, hydraulic lifts, metal being worked, but when they investigated, they found the bay empty and locked. Others reported brief glimpses of someone working at the bay, a 7 workbench, but when they tried to get the mechanic's attention, the figure would seem to fade or disappear. One driver, a woman named Janet, who hauled refrigerated goods, told me she'd once received help with a cooling system problem from a mechanic in Bay 7 who matched Pete's description exactly. Like me, she'd been told by management that no overnight mechanics worked in that bay, and that the employee she'd described had been dead for years. I never returned to Bay 7 for repairs, but I drive past that TA travel center regularly during my routes through Oklahoma. Sometimes, when I'm passing the facility late at night, I can see lights in Bay 7 and the silhouette of someone working at the familiar workbench. Other truckers have told me they've seen the same thing, the outline of a dedicated mechanic who refuses to let death interfere with his commitment to keeping drivers safe on the road. Pete Henderson died, doing what he loved most, fixing trucks and helping drivers solve problems that could strand them far from home. Some people find their purpose so completely that even death can't convince them to retire, and Pete seems to be one of those people. Bay 7 remains his workspace, where the most dedicated mechanic in Oklahoma continues serving drivers who need help, even though his shift officially ended over 5 years ago. Some people serve customers so well that they keep working their shift long after the position has been eliminated. My name is Christina Moore, and I've been a certified hazmat driver for 11 years, hauling dangerous materials across the Gulf Coast states in specially equipped tanker trucks. Hazmat driving requires additional training, specialized equipment, and constant attention to safety protocols that most drivers never encounter. You can't just pull into any truck stop and fuel up hazmat loads. Require dedicated fueling areas with proper ventilation, grounding systems, and attendants trained to handle hazardous material transfers safely. The Pilot Truck Stop on Interstate 20 in Louisiana, about 40 miles west of Shreveport, became my regular fueling stop because it maintained one of the few full-service hazmat fueling areas left in the region. Most truck stops had converted to self-service operations by the 2020s, but hazmat regulations still required trained attendants for certain types of chemical transfers. The facility had 6 fuel islands, but only Island 6 was equipped and staffed for hazmat operations. Jimmy Talbot worked Island 6 during my regular shift hours, and he was exactly the kind of professional you want handling dangerous chemical transfers. Jimmy probably had 30 years of experience with hazmat operations, knew the regulations better than most safety inspectors, and could identify potential problems before they became dangerous situations. More importantly, he understood that hazmat drivers face enough stress without having to deal with incompetent or careless fuel attendants. Morning, Christina. Looks like you're hauling industrial solvents again. Let me get the vapor recovery system connected before we start the fuel transfer. Don't want any of those chemical fumes mixing with diesel vapors during the operation. Jimmy's approach to hazmat fueling was methodical and professional, following safety protocols that went beyond minimum regulatory requirements. He'd check grounding connections twice, verify that all vapor recovery systems were properly sealed, and monitor the entire fueling process to ensure that dangerous materials were never exposed to potential ignition sources. Over 3 years of regular stops, Jimmy and I developed the kind of comfortable working relationship that makes hazmat operations less stressful. He knew my usual cargo types, understood the specific safety requirements for different chemical classifications, and could complete complex fueling procedures efficiently while maintaining absolute safety standards. But what made Jimmy special wasn't just his technical competence. It was his ability to make dangerous work feel routine through professional confidence and friendly conversation. Jimmy had worked in the trucking industry for decades before becoming a fuel attendant, and he had an endless supply of entertaining stories about life on the road during earlier eras of transportation. Back in the 80s, before all these electronic systems and automated safety equipment, we had to rely on experience and common sense to handle dangerous loads. I remember hauling a tanker full of sulfuric acid from Houston to New Orleans during Hurricane Carmen. No computer systems, no GPS navigation, just a paper map, and 30 years of knowing how to read weather conditions. Jimmy's stories helped pass the time during extended fueling procedures, and his encyclopedic knowledge of trucking history provided fascinating insights into how the industry had evolved over the decades. He could describe changes in safety regulations, equipment improvements, and the gradual automation of procedures that had once required specialized human expertise. More importantly, Jimmy understood the psychological challenges of hazmat driving. Hauling dangerous chemicals creates constant awareness that mechanical failures or accidents could have catastrophic consequences. Jimmy's calm professionalism and obvious competence provided reassurance that at least one aspect of hazmat operations was in completely reliable hands. Don't worry about that slight hiss you're hearing, Christina. That's just normal pressure equalization in the vapor recovery system. If there were any real problems, I'd have shut down the operation immediately. Your safety and everyone else's safety is always the first priority. Jimmy never rushed hazmat procedures, even when other drivers were waiting for service or when management pressure might encourage shortcuts. He understood that proper chemical handling required patience and attention to detail, and he was willing to take whatever time was necessary to ensure safe operations. In December of 2024, I stopped at Island 6 for a routine fuel and chemical transfer after picking up a load of industrial cleaning solvents in Houston. Jimmy greeted me with his usual friendly professionalism and began the complex process of connecting vapor recovery lines, grounding systems, and monitoring equipment required for safe hazmat fueling. How's that new tanker working out for you, Christina? I noticed some improvements in the valve configuration compared to your old equipment. Should make chemical transfers more efficient while maintaining safety standards. As always, Jimmy's attention to equipment details impressed me. He'd noticed modifications to my tanker truck that most fuel attendants wouldn't recognize, and he understood how those changes affected fueling procedures. His ability to adapt to different equipment configurations was one of the reasons I preferred Island 6 over other hazmat fueling facilities. During the 30-minute fueling process, Jimmy shared stories about changes in hazmat regulations over the decades, describing how improved safety equipment had reduced risks, but also increased the complexity of routine operations. His historical perspective helped me appreciate how much the industry had evolved during his long career in transportation and fuel handling. Used to be that hazmat drivers had to rely on their own knowledge and experience to identify dangerous situations. Now we've got electronic monitoring, automated safety shutoffs, and computer systems that can detect problems before they become emergencies. Progress has definitely made the job safer, but it's also made human expertise less valued. When the fueling procedure was complete, Jimmy performed his usual thorough inspection of all connections and safety systems before authorizing me to continue my journey. His methodical approach to hazmat operations had become so routine that I'd started taking his exceptional service for granted. But as I prepared to leave the truck stop, I realized that Jimmy's professional competence and friendly service deserved formal recognition. Hazmat attendants who combine technical expertise with genuine customer service are rare, and I wanted to make sure his supervisors understood how valuable his contributions were to both safety and customer satisfaction. I walked to the truck stop's main office, planning to speak with a manager about Jimmy's exceptional service and request that my compliments be added to his employment file. The manager on duty seemed puzzled when I mentioned wanting to commend the attendant who worked Island 6. Island 6? We don't have full-service attendants at any of our fuel islands anymore. Converted to self-service operations back in 2018. All the hazmat fueling is handled through automated systems now, electronic monitoring, computer-controlled safety shutoffs. The whole works. I explained that I'd been receiving personalized service from Jimmy Talbot at Island 6 for over 3 years, describing his appearance and mentioning specific safety procedures he'd performed during hazmat transfers. The manager's expression shifted from confusion to something that looked like recognition and concern. Did you say Jimmy Talbot? Hold on. Let me check some old personnel records. The manager disappeared into a back office for several minutes, returning with a printed employee file and what appeared to be an incident report. His expression suggested he'd found information that he was reluctant to share. Jimmy Talbot did work Island 6 as a hazmat attendant until 2018, but Jimmy died in an accident at that fuel island in October of that year. Explosion during a chemical transfer, faulty equipment, and a spark from somewhere. Jimmy was killed instantly, and we shut down full-service operations immediately afterward. The manager's words didn't seem real. I had recent, detailed memories of conversations with Jimmy, professional interactions that had occurred just hours earlier. I could recall specific safety procedures, technical discussions, and personal stories that Jimmy had shared during hundreds of fueling operations. That's impossible. I just finished talking to Jimmy 30 minutes ago. He handled my entire hazmat transfer, checked all the safety systems, told me stories about trucking in the 80s. He can't have been dead for 6 years. The manager showed me Jimmy's personnel photograph, confirming that it was definitely the same person who'd been providing fuel services at Island 6. The incident report described an explosion that occurred during a routine hazmat transfer, caused by equipment failure that resulted in chemical vapors igniting near an unknown ignition source. Ma'am, I don't know who you think you've been talking to, but Jimmy Talbot has been dead since 2018. Island 6 has been fully automated since then, and we've had several drivers report unusual experiences in that area. That's why we try to direct hazmat customers to other fuel islands when possible. I insisted on returning to Island 6 immediately, hoping to find Jimmy or some explanation for the discrepancy between my experiences and the official records. The manager reluctantly accompanied me to the fuel island area, carrying keys to access equipment that he explained hadn't been used for personalized service in years. Island 6 appeared normal from a distance, but closer inspection revealed details that made my hands shake despite the warm Louisiana afternoon. The fuel dispensers were clearly automated, with digital displays and electronic card readers, but no provisions for attendant operation. The vapor recovery systems were computer-controlled, and safety monitoring was handled entirely through electronic sensors. But the area around Island 6 showed signs that someone had been working there regularly. Worn spots on the concrete where an attendant would stand during fueling operations, oil stains in patterns that suggested habitual use, and tool marks on equipment that indicated recent manual adjustments to automated systems. Most disturbing was a small nameplate beside the fuel controls, reading James Talbot, Senior Hazmat Attendant, in service since 1989. The nameplate was clean and well maintained, as if someone had been taking care of it regularly, despite the fact that the position it commemorated had been eliminated years earlier. Christina, I need to ask you something. During your conversations with Jimmy, did anyone else see him? Have other drivers mentioned receiving personalized service at Island 6? I realized that throughout all my interactions with Jimmy, I'd never encountered other customers receiving simultaneous service at Island 6. Jimmy had always been available exclusively for my hazmat transfers, providing the kind of focused attention that suggested Island 6 was dedicated entirely to my fueling needs. Over the following weeks, I made discreet inquiries among other hazmat drivers who used the Louisiana truck stop, asking if they'd ever received personalized service at Island 6. The responses were consistent and unsettling. Several drivers mentioned brief encounters with a friendly, knowledgeable attendant who seemed to appear when they needed help but disappeared before they could complete transactions or ask for assistance. One driver told me he'd once seen someone working at Island 6 who matched Jimmy's description, but when he tried to get the attendant's attention for help with a complex chemical transfer, the figure seemed to fade away. Another driver mentioned hearing someone talking near Island 6 during overnight stops, discussing safety procedures and equipment maintenance. But when she investigated, she found the area empty. I never returned to Island 6 for fueling, but I drive past that pilot truck stop regularly during my hazmat routes through Louisiana. Sometimes, late at night when the truck stop is quiet, I can see someone moving around Island 6, checking connections, monitoring equipment, maintaining the professional standards that Jimmy had always considered essential for safe hazmat operations. Jimmy Talbot died doing what he devoted his career to, keeping hazmat drivers and the public safe during dangerous chemical transfers. Some people find their professional calling so completely that even death can't convince them to abandon their responsibilities, and Jimmy seems to be one of those people. Island 6 remains his workplace, where the most dedicated hazmat attendant in Louisiana continues serving drivers who understand the value of expertise that transcends the boundaries between life and death. Some deliveries can never be completed, no matter how many times you unload the same cargo at the same destination. My name is Harold Jenkins, and I've been driving specialty transport for 16 years, hauling construction materials, heavy equipment, and industrial supplies to remote job sites across the Mid-Atlantic region. Specialty transport requires more than just driving skills. You need to understand load securement, navigate difficult terrain, and coordinate with construction crews who depend on precise delivery schedules. The work takes me to places that regular freight drivers never see: mountain construction sites, remote mining operations, and infrastructure projects in areas where cell phone coverage doesn't exist and GPS systems become unreliable. Interstate 68 through the Maryland mountains is one of my regular routes, connecting construction projects in the Appalachian region with supply centers in Baltimore and Washington. The highway cuts through some of the most challenging terrain on the East Coast, with steep grades, sharp curves, and weather conditions that can make driving dangerous for inexperienced operators. But it's also the only practical route for reaching construction sites in the remote valleys and ridgelines, where much of the region's infrastructure development takes place. My company, Mountain State Transport, specializes in delivering materials to locations that other carriers avoid, places too remote, too difficult, or too dangerous for standard freight operations. We handle everything from concrete and steel for bridge construction to specialized equipment for mining operations deep in the Appalachian Mountains. The pay is good because few drivers are willing to navigate unmarked mountain roads to reach job sites that exist only as coordinates on engineering surveys. In January of 2025, I received an assignment to deliver construction materials to a road improvement project in the mountains west of Cumberland, Maryland. The load consisted of concrete barrier sections, steel reinforcement materials, and specialized drainage components. Standard highway construction supplies weighing about 35,000 pounds total. The delivery location was accessible only through a network of county roads and Forest Service tracks that would challenge even experienced mountain drivers. The job site was located in a narrow valley about 40 miles from the nearest town, where state highway engineers were upgrading a mountain road to handle increased traffic from logging operations. It was exactly the kind of remote location that Mountain State Transport specialized in reaching, requiring careful route planning and precise coordination with construction crews who worked on tight schedules in difficult conditions. I picked up the load on Monday morning from a supplier in Hagerstown and began the journey west through the Maryland mountains. The route took me through increasingly remote terrain, following Interstate 68 to a series of state highways, then county roads, and finally unmarked forest tracks that appeared on no commercial maps. By late afternoon, I reached the construction site, a temporary work area carved out of dense forest, with equipment staging areas, material storage zones, and temporary buildings to house the engineering crew. The site supervisor, a man named Dave Morrison, met me at the entrance and directed me to an unloading area where a small crane could remove the concrete barriers from my trailer. The unloading process took about 3 hours, with construction workers carefully positioning each component according to engineering specifications. Everything proceeded normally, and by early evening, my trailer was empty and ready for the return journey. But the mountain roads were too dangerous for nighttime navigation, and the construction site had basic accommodations for drivers who needed to stay overnight. Dave Morrison offered me a bunk in the crew quarters, explaining that several other drivers had used the facility during extended delivery operations. I accepted gratefully, planning to begin the return trip at dawn, when visibility would be better for navigating the challenging mountain roads. I parked my truck in the designated area, conducted my usual post-delivery inspection to ensure all cargo restraints were properly stowed, and settled into the crew quarters for the night. The facility was basic but comfortable, with separate sleeping areas, a common kitchen, and basic amenities for workers who spent extended periods at remote job sites. The next morning, I conducted my pre-trip inspection and began loading my personal gear for the return journey to Hagerstown. But when I opened my trailer doors to verify that the cargo area was properly cleaned and ready for the next load, I discovered something that made no sense according to any rational understanding of cause and effect. My trailer was full again, loaded with exactly the same construction materials I had delivered the previous afternoon. The concrete barrier sections were positioned in identical configurations. The steel reinforcement materials were secured with the same tie-down patterns, and even the specialized drainage components were arranged in precisely the same order as the original load. I assumed that another driver had used my trailer for temporary storage, though this would violate standard safety protocols and company policies. I walked to the construction site office to report the problem and get clarification about why materials had been loaded into my supposedly empty trailer without authorization. Dave Morrison seemed confused when I described finding construction materials in my trailer. According to his records, all materials from my Monday delivery had been properly received, documented, and distributed to appropriate work areas throughout the construction site. No additional deliveries were scheduled, and no other drivers had been present at the site overnight. Harold, we unloaded your entire trailer yesterday afternoon. I personally signed the delivery receipt confirming that all materials were received in good condition. There shouldn't be anything in your trailer except maybe some loose debris that we missed during cleanup. But when Dave accompanied me to examine my trailer, we both saw the same thing. A full load of construction materials arranged exactly as they had been during the original delivery. Dave recognized the specific components, noting that they matched the engineering specifications for materials he had received and documented the previous day. This is the same stuff you delivered yesterday. Same concrete barriers, same reinforcement materials, same drainage components. But we've already unloaded and used most of these materials. They're installed at various points along the road project. Dave led me on a tour of the construction site, showing me where the concrete barriers had been positioned along the roadway, where the steel reinforcement had been incorporated into bridge foundations, and where the drainage components had been installed in culvert systems. The materials were clearly in use, integrated into construction work that had proceeded normally after my Monday delivery. But somehow, identical materials had reappeared in my trailer, arranged in exactly the same configuration as the original load. Dave suggested that we document the situation with photographs and contact both our companies to report what appeared to be an impossible duplication of construction materials. Over the next hour, we took detailed photographs of both the materials in my trailer and the identical components already installed throughout the construction site. The comparison was disturbing. Every concrete barrier, every steel beam, every drainage component appeared to exist in two places simultaneously, creating a situation that violated basic principles of physical reality. More unsettling was Dave's discovery of security camera footage from the construction site's surveillance system. The cameras had recorded the entire unloading process on Monday afternoon, clearly showing construction workers removing materials from my trailer and positioning them throughout the work site. But the same cameras had also recorded activity throughout Monday night that Dave couldn't explain. The footage showed my truck and trailer in the parking area after the unloading was completed, with the trailer doors clearly open and the cargo compartment obviously empty. But starting around midnight, the cameras recorded what appeared to be a reverse loading process, materials moving from the construction site back into my trailer, positioning themselves in exactly the same arrangements as the original load. The security footage showed no human involvement in this reverse loading process. Materials simply appeared to move on their own, lifting themselves from work areas throughout the construction site and returning to identical positions in my trailer. The process took several hours to complete, with construction components floating through the air like they were being moved by invisible crews following invisible instructions. Harold, I've been working construction for 25 years, and I've never seen anything like this footage. Materials don't move themselves, and they sure don't duplicate themselves. But that's what the cameras recorded your load, reassembling itself in your trailer, while identical materials remained in place at the worksite. Dave and I spent the rest of the morning trying to understand what had happened and what we should do about the situation. The logical response would be to unload the materials again and continue with normal operations, treating the incident as an unexplained anomaly. But the security footage suggested that the materials would simply return to my trailer, regardless of how many times we unloaded them. We decided to conduct an experiment. Dave's crew unloaded my trailer again, carefully removing all materials and distributing them to storage areas throughout the construction site. We positioned security cameras to monitor both my trailer and the material storage areas, planning to maintain surveillance throughout the night to document any unusual activity. The unloading process proceeded normally, leaving my trailer completely empty by late afternoon. Dave personally verified that no materials remained in the cargo compartment, and we locked the trailer doors to prevent unauthorized access. I spent another night in the crew quarters, planning to monitor the security cameras for any signs of the mysterious reloading process. Around midnight, the cameras recorded exactly the same phenomenon as the previous night. Materials began moving from storage areas throughout the construction site, floating through the air and positioning themselves in my trailer with precise coordination. The process was silent and methodical, as if invisible workers were following detailed loading instructions to recreate the exact configuration of the original delivery. By dawn, my trailer was full again, loaded with the same materials in the same arrangements, ready for a delivery that had already been completed twice, but apparently could never be finished. The materials at the work site remained in place, meaning that identical components now existed in multiple locations simultaneously. Dave Morrison and I documented everything, with photographs, video recordings, and detailed written reports. But neither of our companies knew how to respond to the situation. The engineering firm that managed the construction project had no precedent for dealing with materials that spontaneously duplicated themselves, and my transportation company had no policies covering cargo that refused to stay delivered. I eventually left the construction site with the understanding that I would return to Hagerstown with the mysterious load, but that created a new problem. What do you do with materials that have already been delivered, but continue to exist in your trailer? My company's dispatch system showed the delivery as completed, but my trailer remained full of cargo that apparently could not be permanently unloaded. Over the following weeks, I attempted several more deliveries to different construction sites, but the materials always returned to my trailer by morning. Security cameras at multiple locations recorded the same impossible process construction components moving through the air and repositioning themselves in my trailer, while identical materials remained at their intended destinations. I'm still driving for Mountain State Transport, but I no longer accept assignments involving construction materials or remote mountain delivery sites. The trailer that carried that first load to the Maryland mountains has been permanently retired, parked behind our main facility, where the materials continue to load and unload themselves in endless cycles that no human can observe directly, but which security cameras faithfully document. Some deliveries, it seems, can never be completed because the cargo has developed its own attachment to the journey rather than the destination. The materials I delivered to that mountain construction site in January refused to accept that their transportation has ended, continuing to return to my trailer, as if they prefer being in transit to being permanently installed. Dave Morrison still contacts me occasionally with updates from the construction site, reporting that work continues normally with materials that function properly despite their mysterious origins. But the site's security cameras continue recording the nightly process of materials disappearing and reappearing, following routes that lead from constructed reality back to the cargo space where they seem to believe they belong. Some voices never stop asking for safe passage, even when their journey ended years ago in twisted metal and Wyoming wind. My name is Maria Santos, and I've been a cross-country hauler for 14 years, specializing in time-sensitive freight runs between the West Coast and the Eastern Seaboard. Interstate 80 is my lifeline. 2,800 miles of highway connecting San Francisco to New Jersey, crossing the entire continental United States, through terrain that ranges from California's Central Valley to the Wyoming High Plains to Pennsylvania's industrial corridors. It's honest work that pays well, but it demands constant vigilance, especially through the challenging sections where weather and geography can turn routine drives into survival situations. The Wyoming Wind Corridor between Laramie and Rawlins is one of the most dangerous stretches of highway in America for commercial vehicles. Sustained winds regularly exceed 50 miles per hour, with gusts that can reach 80 or 90 miles per hour during severe weather events. These winds can flip loaded 18-wheelers without warning, and the corridor has claimed dozens of lives over the years from drivers who underestimated the power of Wyoming's relentless wind patterns. CB radio becomes essential survival equipment when crossing the wind corridor. Channel 19 carries constant chatter from truckers sharing real-time wind speed reports, visibility conditions, and warnings about dangerous gusts. Drivers coordinate with each other to determine whether it's safe to continue or whether they should seek shelter at truck stops until conditions improve. The difference between accurate wind information and wishful thinking can determine whether you complete your journey safely or become another roadside memorial. During my regular runs across Interstate 80, I've developed relationships with other drivers who work the same routes. We share weather information, coordinate fuel stops, and provide the kind of mutual support that keeps everyone safer during challenging crossings. The CB radio creates an invisible community of professionals who understand that cooperation and accurate information can mean the difference between life and death during severe weather events. In September of 2024, I began noticing a voice on Channel 19 that didn't fit the normal patterns of trucker communication. Every night around 2 a.m., as I approached or traveled through the Wyoming Wind Corridor, the same transmission would cut through the usual CB chatter. Breaker 19. This is eastbound Interstate 80 at mile marker 215. Looking for current wind conditions through the corridor. Got a time-sensitive load heading for Chicago. Need to know if it's safe to continue or if I should pull over and wait for calmer weather. The voice was professional and courteous, using standard CB protocols and trucker terminology. But something about the transmission felt different from normal driver communications. The voice carried a quality of desperation that went beyond typical concern about weather conditions. It sounded like someone who desperately needed safe passage, but feared that safe passage might not be possible. Initially, I assumed the voice belonged to another regular driver, working similar routes and schedules. Many cross-country haulers maintain consistent timing to optimize fuel stops and avoid urban traffic, so hearing the same voice at predictable times wasn't unusual. I tried several times to respond with current wind information, but the transmissions seemed to be one-way communications that didn't acknowledge responses from other drivers. Breaker 19. This is Maria Santos westbound at mile marker 230. Wind speeds are running about 40 miles per hour, with gusts to 60. Manageable if you keep your speed down and watch for crosswind sections. How's your load secured back there? No response. The voice would repeat the same request for wind conditions, using identical phrasing and the same concerned tone, but never engaged in the back-and-forth conversation that characterizes normal CB communication. Other drivers seemed to ignore the transmission entirely, as if they weren't hearing it or had learned not to respond to it. Over the following weeks, the pattern became predictably disturbing. Every night at exactly 2 a.m., during my crossings through the Wyoming Wind Corridor, the same voice would request wind condition updates. The transmission always originated from mile marker 215, always mentioned a time-sensitive load heading for Chicago, and always carried that undertone of desperation that suggested more than routine concern about weather conditions. More unsettling was the consistency of the timing and location. Mile marker 215 is in one of the most dangerous sections of the wind corridor, where the highway crosses exposed high plains with no natural windbreaks. It's exactly the kind of location where drivers would be most concerned about wind conditions. But it's also the kind of place where accurate weather information becomes critical for survival. During a fuel stop in Laramie in early October, I struck up a conversation with another driver who worked similar routes and asked if he'd been hearing the same nightly transmissions on Channel 19. His reaction was immediately uncomfortable, as if I'd mentioned something he preferred not to discuss. "You talking about the guy who asks for wind conditions every night around 2 a.m.? Yeah, I've been hearing that voice for a couple of years now. Most of us old-timers just ignore it. Nothing good comes from responding to transmissions like that." When I asked what he meant by nothing good, the driver went quiet for several moments before explaining that the voice on Channel 19 had been requesting wind condition updates since 2020, always at the same time and from the same location. According to other drivers who'd been working the route longer than I had, the transmissions had started shortly after a fatal rollover accident in the wind corridor. Driver named Eddie Morrison got caught in a crosswind gust around mile marker 215 back in March of 2020. Wind flipped his rig right over the median into oncoming traffic. Eddie was hauling auto parts to Chicago, running behind schedule, and trying to make up time despite dangerous wind conditions. The other driver's description sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with Wyoming's cold mountain air. The voice I'd been hearing every night was requesting information about the same stretch of highway where Eddie Morrison had died, mentioning the same destination city and expressing the same desperate concern about weather conditions that had ultimately killed him. Eddie was a good driver, been working this route for over 15 years. He knew the wind corridor as well as anyone, understood how dangerous those crosswinds could be. But he had a hot load that needed to be in Chicago by morning, and he thought he could make it through before the worst of the wind hit. According to the driver's account, Eddie Morrison had been requesting wind condition updates over CB radio during the hours before his accident, asking other truckers for real-time weather information that might help him decide whether to continue or seek shelter. His final transmission had come around 2 a.m., just minutes before a wind gust estimated at over 90 miles per hour flipped his truck and trailer. Eddie's last words on the radio were asking for wind conditions at mile marker 215. Same thing you've been hearing every night for the past month. Some of us think Eddie's still out there, still trying to get that load to Chicago, still asking for weather information that might help him make it through the corridor safely. The idea that I'd been hearing the voice of a dead driver was disturbing enough, but what made it truly unsettling was the implication that Eddie Morrison was trapped in an endless loop, repeatedly attempting the same journey that had killed him. Every night at 2 a.m., he was approaching the same dangerous section of highway, carrying the same urgent load, asking for the same weather information that might allow him to complete the delivery he died trying to make. That night, as I approached mile marker 215, right on schedule, I listened carefully for Eddie's transmission. At exactly 2 a.m., his voice crackled through the static with the same desperate request for wind condition updates. But this time, instead of ignoring the transmission or trying to respond with helpful information, I decided to listen more carefully to what Eddie was actually saying. Breaker 19, this is eastbound Interstate 80 at mile marker 215. Looking for current wind conditions through the corridor. Got a time-sensitive load heading for Chicago. Need to know if it's safe to continue or if I should pull over and wait for calmer weather. This load has to be there by morning, and I'm already running behind schedule. Please, somebody give me a wind report. I can't afford to get stuck here, but I can't afford to roll over either. The desperation in Eddie's voice was heartbreaking. He wasn't just asking for weather information. He was pleading for guidance that would help him navigate between impossible choices. Eddie needed to complete his delivery on time, but he also needed to survive the journey. 4 years after his death, he was still trying to find a solution that would allow him to accomplish both goals. I grabbed my CB handset intending to provide Eddie with the wind conditions he'd been requesting every night for years. But as I keyed the microphone, I realized that no information I could give him would change the outcome of his journey. Eddie Morrison was trapped in the moments before his fatal accident, asking for weather updates that wouldn't prevent the wind gust that had killed him. Eddie, this is Maria Santos. Wind conditions are dangerous tonight. Gusts over 70 miles per hour. You need to find shelter and wait for calmer weather. That load isn't worth your life. The transmission that followed was the most chilling thing I'd ever heard on CB radio. Eddie's voice carried a quality of recognition and gratitude that suggested he could hear my response, but also a sadness that came from understanding his situation. Thank you for the wind report, Maria. I appreciate drivers who look out for each other on these dangerous roads, but I've got to try to make it through. This load has to be in Chicago by morning, and I'm already 4 hours behind schedule. Maybe if I keep the speed down and watch for the worst gusts, I can make it through the corridor safely. Eddie's transmission faded into static, leaving me alone with the knowledge that I'd been talking to someone who died 4 years earlier, in the exact location where I was currently driving. But more disturbing was the realization that Eddie was doomed to repeat his fatal journey every night, always hoping that this time he might find a way to navigate safely through the wind corridor that had claimed his life. I completed my crossing of Wyoming that night, but I've never forgotten the sound of Eddie Morrison's voice asking for help that could never come. Other drivers have told me they still hear his nightly transmissions, still requesting wind condition updates that might allow him to complete the delivery he died attempting to make. The Wyoming Wind Corridor remains one of the most dangerous stretches of highway in America, claiming lives from drivers who underestimate the power of high plains wind. But for those who listen carefully to Channel 19 around 2 a.m., Eddie Morrison's voice serves as a constant reminder that some loads aren't worth the risks, and some schedules aren't worth dying for. Eddie's still out there on Interstate 80, still asking for weather information, still hoping that someone might provide the guidance that would help him reach Chicago safely. But some journeys can't be completed, no matter how many times you attempt them. And some voices can't stop asking for help that will never be enough to change their fate. Some signatures appear on paperwork long after the hand that wrote them has gone cold and still. My name is Kenneth Adams, and I've been driving fuel transport trucks for 19 years, hauling gasoline, diesel, and aviation fuel across the Southwest for a regional petroleum distributor. Fuel transport is specialized work that requires hazmat certification, constant safety vigilance, and absolute precision in handling dangerous materials that can explode or cause environmental disasters if mishandled. Every aspect of fuel transport is heavily regulated and meticulously documented, from loading procedures at refineries to delivery protocols at retail stations. The Love's Truck Stop on Interstate 25 in New Mexico, about 30 miles south of Santa Fe, became one of my regular overnight stops during cross-country fuel deliveries. It's strategically positioned for drivers hauling petroleum products between Texas refineries and distribution centers throughout the Mountain West. The facility maintains 24-hour operations with full-service fuel islands, maintenance bays, and the kind of comprehensive record-keeping systems that fuel transport companies require for regulatory compliance. Love's Truck Stops are known for their professional operations and attention to detail, especially regarding hazmat drivers who need specialized services and documentation. Every fuel transaction is recorded with precise timestamps, operator signatures, and detailed records that can be audited by federal agencies. The computerized systems track everything from fuel grades and quantities to payment methods and driver certifications, creating an electronic paper trail that satisfies the most demanding regulatory requirements. During my regular stops at the New Mexico Love's location, I developed a routine that balanced mandatory rest periods with fuel purchases for my personal truck, a separate vehicle that I used for local transportation when not driving company tankers. I'd typically arrive around midnight, park my fuel transport in the designated hazmat area, and use my personal truck for fuel and food purchases during the required rest period. The fuel receipts I received during these stops were always accurate and properly documented, showing the correct fuel grades, quantities, and prices for my personal vehicle purchases. The electronic systems at Love's generated receipts with standard formatting, including transaction times, pump numbers, and employee signatures when manual override was required for certain payment methods. But starting in November of 2024, I began noticing irregularities in the fuel receipts I received during overnight stops at the New Mexico Love's location. Specifically, I started receiving receipts for fuel purchases I hadn't made, signed by an employee whose name I didn't recognize from the staff I'd encountered during regular business hours. The first unusual receipt appeared in my paperwork after a routine overnight stop on November 8th. According to the receipt, I had purchased 37 gallons of diesel fuel at 3:33 a.m., paid with cash, and had the transaction authorized by someone identified as Maintenance Joe Martinez. But I clearly remembered my activities during that stop. I'd purchased only coffee and snacks from the convenience store, used the restroom facilities, and never approached any fuel islands. More puzzling was the fact that my personal truck's fuel gauge still showed nearly empty, exactly as it had been when I arrived at the truck stop. If I had actually purchased 37 gallons of diesel fuel, my tank would have been completely full. But somehow I had a receipt for fuel that wasn't in my truck, purchased with cash I hadn't spent, authorized by an employee I'd never met. I assumed the receipt was a computer error or had been printed for a different customer and accidentally included with my documentation. Fuel stations occasionally experience system glitches that generate incorrect receipts, and the obvious solution was to contact Love's management to correct their records and remove the erroneous charge from any potential billing systems. But when I called the truck stop's main office to report the incorrect receipt, the manager seemed confused by my description of the problem. According to his records, no fuel transactions had been processed under my name during my November 8th stop. The electronic system showed only convenience store purchases, with no fuel sales recorded for my personal vehicle or any payment methods associated with my account. Sir, I'm not showing any diesel fuel purchases for your visit on November 8th. Our computer systems would have records of all fuel transactions, but there's nothing here matching what you've described. Are you sure that receipt came from our location? I faxed a copy of the receipt to the truck stop manager, and he confirmed that it appeared to be authentic. Love's documentation with correct formatting, proper timestamps, and valid transaction codes. But the receipt showed details that didn't match any records in their computer systems, as if the transaction had been processed through parallel documentation systems that left no electronic traces. This is definitely one of our receipts, but I can't find any corresponding transaction in our computer records. The signature you mentioned, Maintenance Joe Martinez, that's someone who used to work here, but he's been gone for over 2 years now. His employee access codes were deactivated when he left the company. Over the following weeks, the pattern continued with disturbing regularity. Every time I stopped at the New Mexico Love's location during overnight hours, I would find fuel receipts in my paperwork showing purchases I hadn't made, always time-stamped at exactly 3:33 a.m., always signed by Maintenance Joe Martinez, always for precise quantities that would have filled my truck's fuel tank if the transactions had actually occurred. But my fuel gauge continued to show empty or near empty levels, confirming that I wasn't actually receiving the fuel documented on the mysterious receipts. The transactions appeared to exist only on paper, creating documentation for purchases that had no corresponding physical reality. More unsettling was the consistency of the timing. Every receipt showed the same timestamp, 3:33 a.m., regardless of when I had actually visited the truck stop. Whether I arrived at midnight, 2 a.m., or 4 a.m., the phantom fuel receipts always showed transactions occurring at exactly 3:33 in the morning. During a conversation with another fuel transport driver, who used the same route. I mentioned the unusual receipts and asked if he'd experienced similar documentation problems at Love's truck stops. His reaction was immediately uncomfortable, as if I'd touched on something he preferred not to discuss. "You talking about receipts signed by Joe Martinez?" "Yeah, I've heard about that from other drivers. Joe was the overnight maintenance supervisor at that Love's location for about 15 years. Good guy. Really cared about helping drivers with equipment problems and fuel system issues." The driver went on to explain that Joe Martinez had been known throughout the trucking community for his dedication to helping drivers, especially those hauling hazmat loads who needed specialized assistance with fuel transfers and equipment maintenance. Joe worked overnight shifts because that's when most fuel transport drivers needed services, and he developed a reputation for going above and beyond normal job requirements to ensure driver safety and equipment reliability. Joe died of a heart attack at his workstation in March of 2022. Found him the next morning at his desk in the maintenance office, paperwork still spread out in front of him, like he'd been working on driver service requests, right up until the end. The driver's description of Joe Martinez's death sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with New Mexico's high desert climate. I'd been receiving fuel receipts signed by someone who had been dead for over 2 years, documenting transactions that somehow occurred at the exact location where Joe had spent his final night helping drivers with fuel and maintenance issues. But here's the strange thing about those receipts, the driver continued. Other fuel haulers have told me that when they get those phantom receipts signed by Joe, their trucks run better than they should. Fuel efficiency improves. Engines run smoother. Equipment problems seem to resolve themselves. Like Joe's still taking care of drivers, even though he's not officially working there anymore. That observation made me reconsider my own experiences during recent stops at the New Mexico Love's location. While my fuel gauge continued to show empty, my truck's performance had been exceptionally good. Better fuel economy than normal, smoother engine operation, and none of the minor mechanical issues that typically develop during extended highway driving. It was as if the phantom fuel documented on Joe's receipts was somehow reaching my truck despite not being visible in the fuel tank. The impossible transactions were providing real benefits, improving my vehicle's performance in ways that couldn't be explained by normal mechanical or chemical processes. 3 weeks later, during another overnight stop at the Love's location, I decided to stay awake and monitor my truck during the early morning hours to see if I could observe whatever was happening at 3:33 a.m. I parked in a position that provided a clear view of the fuel islands and settled in to watch for any unusual activity around my vehicle. At exactly 3:33 a.m., I saw something that made me question my understanding of what was possible in the physical world. A figure approached my truck from the direction of the maintenance building, someone wearing a Love's uniform shirt and carrying what appeared to be fueling equipment. The figure moved with the methodical purpose of someone performing routine maintenance tasks. But the figure was translucent, visible but somehow not quite solid. I could see through him to the background landscape, as if he were made of morning mist rather than flesh and blood. The translucent maintenance worker opened my truck's fuel cap, connected invisible fueling equipment, and appeared to transfer fuel that I couldn't see into a tank that remained visibly empty. The entire process took about 15 minutes, conducted with the same professional care and attention to detail that I'd heard described in stories about Joe Martinez's work ethic. When the phantom fuel transfer was complete, the translucent figure closed my fuel cap, made notes on invisible paperwork, and walked back toward the maintenance building, fading away entirely as he reached the shadows near the Love's main facility. The next morning, I found another fuel receipt in my documentation. 37 gallons of diesel fuel, purchased at 3:33 a.m., cash payment, authorized by Maintenance Joe Martinez. And despite my fuel gauge still showing empty, my truck ran perfectly throughout the next leg of my journey, achieving fuel economy that should have been impossible with the amount of diesel actually visible in my tank. I never reported what I'd observed to Love's management or to my company's safety department. Some experiences transcend the boundaries of official incident reports and regulatory documentation. Instead, I've learned to accept Joe Martinez's continued service as a gift from someone who couldn't quite let go of his responsibility to take care of drivers. The phantom fuel receipts still appear in my paperwork during overnight stops at the New Mexico Loves location. Always timestamped at 3:33 a.m. Always signed by someone who died over 2 years ago. But my truck continues to run on fuel that exists only as signatures on impossible receipts. Proof that some people's dedication to helping others extends far beyond their official employment. Joe Martinez continues working the overnight shift at Love's truck stop, filling tanks that show empty, signing receipts that document the impossible, and ensuring that fuel transport drivers receive the care and attention they need to complete their journeys safely. Some signatures never fade, and some service never ends, no matter what the employment records might say about who's currently on the payroll.